Hello, fellow sapiens, and welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you are drifting toward sleep, passing time on a quiet journey, or simply searching for a calm voice in the night, this space is here for you. Because tonight we journey into the story of Ice Age extinction and how nearly all of humanity was swept to the edge of disappearance. This is calm storytelling and deep time science. It is the untold story of a near-forgotten age, when across hundreds of thousands of years, shifting climates and silent ice reduced our ancestors to only a sliver of survival. A population so small that every one of us alive today descends from perhaps just over 1,000 souls. In the stillness of that deep past, endurance was carved not in conquest, but in firelight, hunger, and fragile bonds of care. But the truth is not simply about how they almost vanished. It is about why 1% endured when all the rest were lost. Oh, and if you are someone who loves long-form science woven with quiet wonder, consider tapping like and subscribe. It helps this type of thoughtful storytelling reach more curious minds across the world. I wonder where you are listening from, and what the clock says for you right now. If you feel like sharing, let me know in the comments. Our voices gather here across time zones like sparks in the dark. And, by the way, if sleep comes, let it. You will find timestamps in the description to guide you back. Now, let us begin with a world on the brink. The story we are about to trace is not just about the cold, or the sweeping glaciers, or the beasts that roamed under grey skies. It is about the razor's edge on which humanity balanced, when almost all of our kind vanished, and only a fraction survived. Genetic echoes tell us that fewer than 1 in 100 endured through the ordeal, leaving behind a fragile thread from which every living person is descended. To understand how such a catastrophe could come to pass, and why survival was even possible, we first need to step into a world that looked deceptively stable, a world where rivers swelled, forests flourished, and small bands of humans thrived without imagining the scale of change that loomed ahead. 900,000 years ago, Earth rested in an interglacial pause, one of those warmer intervals between longer, harsher glacials. The climate was generous, though not without its fluctuations. Rivers carved wide valleys across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Grasslands spread into open plains where herds of elephant, bison, and wild horses grazed, while forests offered fruits, nuts, and shelter. For human ancestors, likely populations of Homo erectus and their close kin, this was a season of relative abundance. The archaeological traces from this period show signs of confidence. Stone tools, though simple, were becoming more refined. Large cutting implements known as Acheulean hand axes appear in river terraces and ancient campsites, suggesting that these early people had both the knowledge and stability to invest time in shaping tools that lasted. Charred plant remains and bones-bearing cut marks hint at organized meals around small fires, though the evidence is scattered and tentative. What we do know is that these communities were spreading, exploring, and building patterns of life that must have felt enduring. But interglacials are never permanent. They are interludes in a longer rhythm, driven by the slow tilting and wobbling of Earth's orbit around the Sunday. What must it have felt like to live within this span of warmth, unaware that the planet's celestial mechanics were already drawing the curtain on the stage? Seasons grew unpredictable, rains shifted, and the first signals of instability appeared in the bones of animals and the pollen records buried in lake beds. To us, looking back, they are warning signs. To them, they were simply strange years, harder winters, or leaner harvests of wild foods. The haunting question, then, is how could our ancestors sense that their flourishing world was already narrowing into a trap? The subtle shifts that crept into the environment were almost imperceptible at first. A river that once swelled with fish now ran shallower in certain seasons. Herds that had grazed across wide open spaces began to move differently, migrating sooner or failing to appear at all. To the people who depended on them, these were not signs of global change but local puzzles, the kind of uncertainties every forager had to navigate. Yet in the soil, in the chemistry of ancient shells, and in the microscopic grains of pollen trapped in sediment layers, we find a larger story written, a story of Earth itself slipping back toward cold. Scientists piecing together these clues see the fingerprints of orbital cycles. Earth's path around the Sun is not fixed. It stretches and shifts over tens of thousands of years, altering the amount of sunlight falling on different latitudes. 900,000 years ago, these rhythms tipped the balance. Summers grew cooler, allowing snow to linger. Year after year, ice accumulated at high latitudes, and glaciers began their slow, grinding march south. The warmth of the interglacial was not ending all at once, but it was being eroded, chipped away by forces no human could see or understand. For our ancestors, life still appeared abundant. Fossil evidence suggests that human groups ranged widely, from temperate forests in Europe to grasslands in Africa and into the vast expanse of Asia. They crafted hand axes with symmetrical precision, some so finely made that researchers still debate whether they carried symbolic as well as practical value. Bones at sites like Boxgrove in England or Gesher Benot Yaakov in the Levant show that these early humans hunted large game and gathered a wide spectrum of plant foods. Such versatility would one day be crucial, but at the time it must have seemed like a normal rhythm of existence. And yet, in that rhythm, the first dissonant notes were sounding. The record of animal remains hints at changing ecosystems. Species adapted to warmth fading from the scene, while cold-loving fauna slowly expanded their ranges. The pollen samples suggest forests retracting, replaced by grasslands and tundra. These were signals of landscapes in transition, transformations that would tighten the circle around human survival. So what happens when a species thrives in a window of plenty, never knowing that the window is slowly closing? What emerges from this evidence is not a single dramatic collapse, but a slow tightening of the world, a kind of ecological narrowing that pressed against human lives in subtle, relentless ways. Imagine a band of hunters setting out across familiar plains, expecting to track red deer as their ancestors had done for generations, only to find herds thinner, more restless, or entirely absent. Imagine gatherers reaching for fruits that once ripened in abundance, only to find fewer berries clinging to branches, their sweetness dulled by harsher seasons. These are the kinds of shifts that would not have sounded alarms but would have worn down the fabric of daily life, thread by thread. Archaeologists describe this period as one of alternating opportunity and scarcity. Some sites show signs of abundance, large butchering areas where multiple animals were processed, suggesting successful hunts. Others reveal only the scattered bones of small prey or heavy reliance on plant foods and shellfish. The variability itself may have been the true challenge. Stability allows for traditions to form, while unpredictability forces constant recalibration. For early humans, this meant that knowledge passed down might not always match the new reality. The environment was rewriting the rules faster than culture could adapt. The first subtle signs of stress appear even in the bones of our ancestors. Studies of fossilized teeth show lines of disrupted growth, etched during childhood episodes of malnutrition or illness. These faint scars are forensic whispers of years when food was scarce or winters were harsher. Some individuals survived such trials and grew to adulthood, but many did not. Each line is a reminder that survival was already precarious, even before the great glaciations descended in full. Yet it would be misleading to paint this world as only struggle. It was also an age of innovation. Evidence from sites like Olor-Joseli in Kenya suggests that humans were beginning to transport stone over long distances, perhaps valuing certain rock for its sharpness or symbolic power. At Gesher Benot Yaakov, fire traces appear in association with clusters of artifacts, hinting at repeated use of flames for cooking or warmth. These are fragile clues, but they tell us that even as the climate pressed harder, people were experimenting with ways to expand their margin of survival. The paradox is striking. Abundance and decline unfolding together. Resilience growing precisely as conditions became less forgiving. Perhaps this is always the way with humans, that we invent most urgently when the world threatens to unmake us. But can invention alone shield a species from forces that reshape entire continents? As the centuries unfolded, these subtle transformations gathered strength, and the abundant interglacial world began to show fractures. The balance between warm intervals and cooling periods is written into Earth's deep time rhythms, but for those living within them, the changes would have felt like shifting ground beneath their feet, never sudden enough to explain, but insistent enough to disrupt. We can imagine the confusion of a people who knew the stars well enough to follow seasons, yet could not predict why winters lingered longer or why spring warmth arrived late, brittle and uncertain. Fossil and sediment records from across Africa and Eurasia reveal that rainfall patterns altered dramatically. Lakes shrank, rivers meandered into shallows, and forests drew back into narrower bands along coastlines and sheltered valleys. Where fertile plains had once offered dependable grazing for herbivores, dry expanses began to spread. Herds moved restlessly, their ranges shifting north and south in uneasy rhythms. For the people who depended on these animals, following them meant longer journeys and greater risks. The archaeological sites that survive from this period illustrate both endurance and fragility. In some caves, layers of ash suggest repeated use of fire, perhaps as a way to cope with colder nights. In open-air sites, concentrations of stone tools appear in patches, then vanish for long intervals, as though groups came and went depending on whether the land could sustain them. These gaps are haunting, as if voices fell silent, entire families or communities erased by seasons too lean to endure. And still, even in this narrowing world, traces of curiosity flicker. At certain sites, pieces of ochre or unusually shaped stones appear, items that may not have had immediate survival value. Perhaps they were simply curiosities. Perhaps they held meanings we cannot recover, but their presence reminds us that these were not only creatures of necessity, but also minds capable of wonder. Even while standing at the edge of scarcity, to think of them in this way is to recognize both the closeness and the distance between us. They were humans in every sense of fragility and hope, watching their world contract while clinging to skills, stories, and experiments that gave them a chance to continue. But when the cold strengthened and the forests thinned further, when the ice crept down from the north, was there anything that could have truly prepared them for the ordeal to come? The first whispers of what was to come did not arrive with thunder but with silence. Silence in the absence of birds, where once there had been flocks. Silence in valleys where rivers dwindled to narrow threads of water. Silence in the diminished footsteps of herds that had grown sparse across the plains. These were the omens that foreshadowed the Ice Age in the lived reality of human ancestors. For them, survival was always delicate, but now that delicacy was tested in ways that stretched across lifetimes, we know these things not through stories handed down, for none could survive so long, but through the forensic fragments the land has preserved. Pollen cores extracted from the depths of ancient lakes show abrupt declines in tree species, evidence that forests withered as colder, drier conditions spread. Animal bones reveal changes in diet. Fewer large grazers, more small game, shellfish, and opportunistic sources of food. In human remains, faint growth disruptions etched in enamel bear witness to hungry seasons endured by children. These fragments are the quiet testimonies of lives shaped by change they could not name. Yet there was resilience too, and it is crucial not to overlook it. People did not merely suffer passively under the weight of climate shifts. They adjusted, wandered, experimented. Some groups moved along coasts, gathering shellfish when inland plains grew barren. Others followed herds into harsher latitudes, clothing themselves in hides, finding refuge in caves, tending fire against the dark. There is evidence of long transport of stone, suggesting networks that reached farther than before, exchanges of knowledge and material that widened the margin of survival. This was the world on the brink, a place where abundance and collapse were interwoven, where every innovation emerged against the backdrop of loss. From our vantage now, it is tempting to ask how much they understood of what was unfolding. Did they see the larger arc, or did they live only in the rhythm of seasons, enduring one hardship at a time? We cannot know, but the traces they left suggest both struggle and persistence. What matters most is that these early humans carried within them the seeds of adaptability that would later define our species. The coming ice would grind continents and nearly erase them. Yet, even here, in the last warmth before the descent, we see hints of the endurance that would allow a mere fraction, perhaps only 1 in 100, to survive. The stage was set, the curtain drawn back, and the great ordeal of the Ice Age was beginning to gather. So the lingering question is this: when the warmth you take for granted begins to slip away, and the ground beneath your life grows uncertain, what do you carry forward into the cold? You carry forward the habits, the memories, and the fragile tools that once gave you comfort. But the warmth you remember no longer lingers in the air. Seasons arrive colder, slower, and unfamiliar. This is how the descent begins, not with catastrophe, but with a shift so gradual, so vast, that only from our vantage across time does its full arc become clear. The Ice Age did not arrive overnight. Its rhythm was carved by celestial patterns, vast orbital cycles that turn not in hours or seasons, but in tens of thousands of years. Earth's journey around the Sun is not a perfect circle, but an ellipse that stretches and compresses over time. The angle of Earth's axis tilts, the wobble of its spin precesses, and all of it together alters the way sunlight touches the planet. These Milankovitch cycles, as they're now known, create subtle variations in solar energy. On their own, they are mild. But combined, they become powerful enough to stack seasons against each other, to let snow persist a little longer year after year until a threshold is crossed and ice begins to build. 900,000 years ago, that threshold was met. Summers cooled just enough to let winter's snow linger at high latitudes. Not all at once, not across every continent, but in slow, irregular pulses. Glaciers formed in the northern reaches, spreading their weight across the land. Each new year layered more ice atop the last, compressing old snow into blue-white masses thick enough to crush stone, and with the ice came wind. As glaciers grew, they altered atmospheric currents, rerouting storm tracks and shifting rainfall patterns. The once familiar balance of wet and dry began to warp. Tropical regions experienced more frequent droughts. Temperate grasslands dried and cracked. The great forests of Africa and Eurasia began their long retreat, folding in on themselves, leaving open patches and bare spaces where trees had once whispered in abundance. What humans would have noticed first may not have been the cold itself, but the things that came with it, the rivers that no longer flooded, the animals that moved on unfamiliar paths, the thinning of edible roots or berries that once ripened like clockwork. These were the first warnings, not spoken, not written, but lived. So the deep question is not simply how the ice formed, but how it began to pull human life into its orbit, how it demanded new responses, new movements, and eventually, new ways of being. What does it mean for a species to hear the world itself changing, and to feel called to change in return? The first answer to that question was movement. As the climate shifted, so did the land, and with it the possibilities of life. Grasslands turned brittle, lakes dried into salt flats, forests retreated, leaving behind scattered groves and dry woodlands. For early humans, this meant that the familiar paths no longer led to familiar rewards. Waterholes disappeared. Herds changed their migrations. Shelter was harder to find. Staying put became a risk, and so small groups packed what they could carry and moved, not as exiles, but as searchers drawn by memory, intuition, or the instinct to follow the animals. We cannot know exactly what they felt, but in the archaeological record, we see the long echoes of their responses. Layers of tools in one place, then none. Campfires clustered beside seasonal rivers. New tools appearing in regions where once there had been none. The traces are faint, but they tell a story of growing restlessness of a species not yet fully formed, but already responding to the friction of change. The landscapes they entered were reshaped by ice, even where glaciers had not yet reached. Meltwater carved new river systems. Dust storms, born from drying soils, cloaked wide plains in hazy veils. In some places, volcanic activity, triggered by the shifting pressure of glacial weight, rumbled beneath the Earth. These were not only migrations through space, but migrations into uncertainty, into landscapes that demanded new strategies. And in response, the early humans did what we so often do. They adapted, but only just. Evidence suggests that clothing began to emerge during this era, though not in the form we imagine. Scrapers made from flint or bone were likely used to process hides, softening them, shaping them into wraps or coverings, not tailored garments, but protection enough to shield the body against bitter winds. Fire became more than warmth. It became ritual, rhythm, memory. Where fuel was scarce, families may have carried embers wrapped in moss or bark, stoking them gently to keep the spark alive. At sites such as Beech's Pit in England or Gesher Benot Yaakov in the Levant, concentrations of burned flint and wood hint at repeated, purposeful fire use. Not accidental flames, but flames that anchored the night, that turned cold and dark into something survivable. These were the early signals of transformation. Not inventions born of leisure, but of necessity. Not cultural revolutions, but quiet recalibrations. The world was no longer the world they had known. The skies above were colder, the ground beneath them more brittle. In the bones of animals, in the shape of leaves, in the silence where birdsong once lived, something enormous was stirring. So we must ask, how much change can a body absorb before it becomes a different kind of body altogether? Perhaps the answer lies in the footprints, not the literal ones, though a few do remain, pressed into the volcanic muds of places like Ilaret and Laetoli, but in the paths carved through time by those who refused to stand still. As environments changed, so did the range of human movement. Once localized populations began to spread, some northward into colder zones, others clinging to the thinning belts of warmth. What may have once been seasonal foraging routes slowly lengthened into generational migrations. And with each journey came the quiet question, where next? This was not a mass migration, not a great wave sweeping across continents, but something more intimate, families adjusting their range. Elders remembering when the herds once grazed closer, children learning new routes through unfamiliar terrain. In this way, humanity's response to the Ice Age began as a test of memory and endurance, not technology. The tools were still simple, the minds were not. We see this in the lithic evidence. Hand axes continued to be shaped with care, but the materials changed. Different stones sourced from distant sites, selected not just for utility, but perhaps also for beauty or significance. The Achulian tradition, so widespread and durable, began to show regional flavors, subtle shifts that suggest experimentation. There was no blueprint. There were only options, each one tried in the shadow of growing cold. Animal remains at many sites tell a story of dietary flexibility. Humans who once hunted red deer and aurochs now turn to smaller, leaner game, hares, birds, even reptiles. In coastal regions, shellfish middens grow thicker in this period, hinting at a growing reliance on marine resources. What the land no longer offered in plenty, the shores and rivers sometimes still could. Adaptability was not a single act. It was a habit learned, shared, repeated. Yet even adaptation came at a cost. Infant survival rates likely dropped. Seasonal births may have become harder to time. Foraging distances grew longer, placing more stress on the elderly and the weak. Conflict with rival groups may have increased, not out of aggression, but scarcity, too many hungry mouths circling the same shrinking territory. These are only inferences, drawn from the patterns and absences in the archaeological record. But the silences are as telling as the artifacts. Somewhere in this tension, between ingenuity and exhaustion, a deeper transformation was beginning to take place. Not of bodies that would come later, but of awareness. The land no longer offered what it once did. The rules were changing, and for those who listened, for those who watched the patterns of the stars and the movements of the birds, the conclusion must have been unmistakable. The question that rises here is simple, but profound. How do you preserve memory, meaning, and belonging when the world you belong to is vanishing around you? The answer, if there was one, might have rested in something less visible than tools or migrations, in the quiet evolution of social bonds. As the cold deepened and the Earth's climate slipped further from what early humans had known, survival began to depend less on individual strength and more on the ability to share, to teach, to remember together. In an age where the world itself became a kind of test, connection became a form of resilience. There are no direct fossils of compassion, but there are bones that healed fractures that would not have mended without care, without someone pausing their own hunger to tend to another. There are burials where bodies were laid carefully, sometimes with red ochre or simple offerings. These are gestures that whisper of belonging of individuals who mattered beyond their immediate utility. And perhaps most telling of all, there are the fire pits clustered close to shelters, as if stories were told when the nights grew too long and silence too heavy. The cold was not uniform. Ice did not fall like a curtain across the entire planet. Rather, it spread in tongues and pulses, shaping some regions into frozen plains while leaving others patchwork and seasonal. But the psychological pressure of instability was global. People needed to know not only how to hunt or gather, but where to go, when to move, and who to trust. This required knowledge, memory, and a kind of oral infrastructure. It may have required language in more developed forms, not simply to name, but to plan. Here, the geological and the cognitive begin to blur. The glacial cycles, cold and mathematical, spun their influence through wind and rain, through plant growth and animal migration. But in doing so, they also pressured the evolution of thought. Communication became more than a convenience, it became a lifeline. Groups that could organize, coordinate, and share lessons may have endured longer, left more descendants, passed on more of themselves. Some researchers speculate that this period coincided with early expansions of brain regions related to social cognition, theory of mind, empathy, foresight. We must be cautious. Fossils do not speak, and the evidence is always partial. But it is compelling to imagine that the very cold which drove us outward also pushed us inward into deeper cooperation, deeper remembering, deeper feeling. And so, beneath the glaciers and beside the fires, a new kind of mind may have begun to take shape. Not one defined by brute logic or raw reaction, but one capable of imagining what others might need, or fear, or hope for. In that imagining, there may have been warmth no season could take away. So the mystery lingers. Was it the body that adapted first? Or was it the mind that stepped into the future? One thought ahead of the ice. Whatever the order, body or mind, the trajectory was now unmistakable. The planet was shifting beneath the feet of its inhabitants. Glaciers expanded further into Europe and Asia, pushing walls of ice across the northern world. Entire ecosystems were swallowed, forests ground down to bare rock, valleys flattened by frozen weight. Sea levels fell, exposing new land bridges between continents, temporary corridors for animals and humans alike to cross. What had once been a wide and stable world, now fractured into zones of refuge and desolation. And still, the human response was not retreat. It was reorientation. In Africa, where much of humanity's story begins, the changes were more nuanced but just as profound. Some regions became drier, others wetter. The rains shifted, not only in amount, but in rhythm. Lakes appeared and vanished. Grasslands came and went. Bands of humans had to continually reassess what they knew. Routes once reliable became treacherous, while forgotten paths turned fertile again. In this fluid landscape, memory was not enough. Only those who could reinterpret memory, who could ask new questions of the land, would survive. We see signs of this recalibration in the archaeological record. In regions like southern Kenya, clusters of Acheulean tools appear near ancient lake margins that fluctuated with the climate. These are not the static campsites of a people who had settled. They are snapshots of motion, of trial and error, of seasonal or even generational experimentation with place. And perhaps this was the beginning of something else, a widening sense of scale. To endure the Ice Age, humans could no longer think in the narrow terms of a single season or single territory. They had to think in years, in landscapes, in patterns large enough to map onto shifting environments. This required not only awareness, but imagination. It required some capacity to project into the unknown, to say, in essence, if the rains failed here, they may have fallen elsewhere. It was a seed of the kind of thinking that would one day chart oceans and map stars. The deep cold, then, was not just a test of physiology. It was a crucible for foresight. It asked of early humans not just how to survive, but how to anticipate. And though we cannot interview them, cannot ask what they dreamed about as the wind howled through broken forests and dust settled on abandoned trails, we can listen to the echoes in their choices, where they moved, how they hunted, what they carried. What we find is not despair, but determination. So the quiet question that ends this part of the journey is not whether the Ice Age began. We know it did. The deeper question is this: what part of humanity began with it? That beginning, the part of humanity shaped by the cold, reveals itself not through tools or migrations, but through the body itself. Because when language is lost, when the camps are long abandoned and the fire's gone cold, the bones remain. And within those bones we find the faint signatures of suffering, etched into calcium like the rings of a dying tree. In children's teeth, thin horizontal grooves tell of moments when the body could not grow, moments when nutrition faltered and survival was uncertain. These are called Harris lines, formed during repeated episodes of stress. They speak of hunger, not just once, but often. A season of poor rains, a year when the herds never came, a winter longer than the body could endure. The skull, too, remembers. A condition known as porotic hyperostosis leaves the inside of the cranium textured and porous, the mark of chronic anemia, often caused by iron deficiency. It is the body's desperate attempt to make more blood, and its signal is left behind in bone that looks moth-eaten. In life, it might have meant dizziness, weakness, and fatigue. In death, it tells us that nourishment was no longer dependable. These signs are not rare. Across sites in Europe, Africa, and Western Asia, skeletal remains from the colder periods show repeated evidence of hardship. Children buried in shallow soil, never having reached full height. Adolescents with deformed joints and underdeveloped teeth. Adults whose spines bear the scars of relentless strain, lifting, walking, carrying too much for too long with too little food. There are no dramatic battle scenes in these records, no mass graves or clear signs of sudden violence. What we see instead is a slow erosion of health, of strength, of continuity. Communities may have collapsed not from invasion or catastrophe, but from absence. Absence of prey, absence of plants, absence of warmth, and perhaps most painfully, the absence of another group nearby to share with. When you begin to read these bodies as records, a quiet horror takes shape. You start to wonder how many children went hungry so that adults could hunt. How many elders quietly gave up their share? How many small bands disappeared, not in one moment, but over the course of 5 or 6 hard seasons, unnoticed by time, unmarked by any burial? What the bones show us is not just that people died, but that they lived on the edge for generations, one illness, one injury, one failed foraging trip away from vanishing. To live on that edge was to enter a world of narrowing choices. As climates shifted and ecosystems transformed, the hunting and gathering patterns that once sustained human groups began to fray. The large grazers, elephants, aurochs, wild horses, still roamed in places, but they moved differently now. Their migrations were less predictable, their numbers thinning in some regions. Forests that once bore fruit grew sparse. Rivers that teemed with fish became shallow or froze over for longer stretches. What had once been a varied menu of opportunity became a lottery of scarcity. The archaeological record reflects this quiet panic. At certain sites, the variety of food remains begins to contract. Shell middens, ancient piles of discarded shells, grow in places far from the ocean, suggesting that inland groups had journeyed long distances in search of marine food. In other regions, an increase in the remains of small animals like rodents or birds appears in layers dated to colder periods. These were not high-calorie prizes, but last resort's the kind of prey that requires far more energy to catch than it provides in return. Tools change too. Rather than specialization, we often see simplification, a signal, perhaps, of survival over refinement. Some sites show crude, hastily made flakes rather than the symmetrical, carefully crafted hand axes of earlier years. It may have been that long-term thinking was no longer a luxury. If you did not know where your next meal would come from, what mattered most was making a sharp edge quickly. Not a perfect one. Yet there were still innovations at certain glacial period sites. Evidence emerges of pit traps and coordinated hunting efforts, signs that some groups, even under pressure, managed to organize and adapt. The use of fire remains a constant in many regions, and in some, it seems to have expanded. Burned bones suggest roasting. Charred plant material may hint at cooking methods that made otherwise inedible roots or seeds digestible. These fragments tell of minds still at work, still solving problems, even as the margin for error grew thin. But ingenuity was not always enough. Many regions show long gaps in human occupation, places where the archaeological record simply goes silent. These voids are perhaps the most chilling clues of all. A place once full of life, now empty. No tools, no bones, no signs of return. Whether these were temporary abandonments or permanent disappearances, we cannot say with certainty. But we can infer that some landscapes, once generous, had turned hostile enough to drive people away or erase them. And so we must ask, when the land no longer gives, when the rivers dry and the herds vanish, what holds a group together and what causes it to let go? Sometimes, it is not the strength of a group that decides its fate, but its size. Small populations are vulnerable in ways that go beyond simple numbers. A wound that might heal in a village could be fatal in a family of 6. A failed hunt that could be absorbed by 100 mouths might mean starvation for 10. In the archaeological shadows of the Ice Age, we glimpse this fragility again and again through gaps, absences, and the occasional haunting presence of a solitary burial. One of the most striking examples comes from Atapuerca, in northern Spain, where the remains of early humans were found deep in a cave system. Some of the skeletons show signs of chronic illness and injury, and yet they lived long enough for bones to begin healing. This suggests care, a community that tended to the sick. But not far from them, other bones appear, scattered, broken, with no clear burial. Perhaps these were individuals lost during a sudden crisis, or perhaps their deaths were never meant to be remembered at all. The smaller the group, the greater the pressure on every individual. One skilled tracker lost to injury, one gatherer caught in a storm, one child carried too long, too far. These are not dramatic collapses, they are quiet unravelings. And in glacial times, when resources were scarce and winters long, such losses were almost impossible to recover from. Genetic studies support this picture. Analysis of ancient human DNA shows signs of what scientists call bottlenecks, periods where our ancestral population shrank drastically, sometimes to just a few thousand individuals. These are not merely dips in numbers, they are events that reshape the genetic future. In each bottleneck, countless lineages were lost forever. What survived was not necessarily the strongest, but the most fortunate or the best connected. Connectivity may have been the real lifeline. A group that could meet, trade, or intermarry with another had options. It could exchange tools, stories, food, even people. But when distances grew too wide, or climate turned one path impassable, isolation set in. And with isolation came vulnerability. A single bad winter, a broken ankle, an infection. Without allies, these became extinction events. So when we look at a stone scraper or a pile of bones, we are not just seeing the past, we are seeing risk calculations, decisions made under pressure, in silence, with stakes we can scarcely imagine. Eat the last of the roots now, or wait for the rains? Stay by the river and risk freezing, or push into the hills and risk thirst? These questions weren't answered in words carved in stone. They were answered in footsteps, in choices made under heavy skies. And the bones, left behind, quietly record which answers were wrong. In the quietest corners of the archaeological record, there are moments when you can almost feel the weight of uncertainty not in what was found, but in what is missing. These gaps are not just voids in data, they are absences with meaning. A site once inhabited for generations suddenly shows no sign of return. Hearths go cold, tools are left unfinished, animal bones disappear. Whether the people moved, died, or simply stopped leaving traces, we are left with a silence that feels deliberate. And within that silence, hunger leaves its own kind of fingerprint. One of the more subtle clues lies in the bones of animals themselves. When herds become scarce, people often shift their focus to smaller or more desperate options. Marrow-rich bones cracked open for every last calorie, gnawed evidence of boiling or roasting beyond what was typical. In some sites, even burned bone fragments were pulverized, possibly to extract the final traces of fat. These are not the habits of abundance, they are the rituals of desperation. Plants, too, leave a record. In hearth ash and grinding stones, scientists have identified starches from seeds and roots that are nearly inedible without processing. Some of these plants require leaching, soaking, or cooking to remove toxins. The fact that people went to such lengths tells us how thin the options had become. Every edible possibility was tested. Every marginal food was brought into the circle of survival. And yet, these strategies had their limits. Malnutrition is not only about too little food, it's also about the wrong food, eaten too often. A diet of acorns, for example, without proper preparation, can lead to digestive problems or long-term toxicity. Over-reliance on lean meat in the absence of fat or plant carbohydrates can cause a condition modern researchers call rabbit starvation. In short, it is possible to eat and still waste away. This too shows up in the skeletons, teeth worn flat from chewing tough, fibrous plants, joint deformities caused by long-term deficiencies. Even the angle of the pelvis or curvature of the spine can whisper of lives spent in perpetual motion, bending, lifting, scraping, all for calories that never quite arrived in time. But among the bleakness, there is also persistence. Some sites show evidence of return, even after long gaps. Perhaps a band moved away during a hard season and came back when the land offered more. Perhaps survivors found new ways to coax nourishment from the earth, new plants to eat, new animals to follow, new knowledge born from trial. These returns, though rare, suggest not only resilience, but memory. A place abandoned was not always forgotten. Sometimes it was simply waiting. So the question becomes, when hunger becomes the teacher, and the land becomes a test, what kind of knowledge survives, and who is left to remember it? To survive a landscape like that, where hunger is the teacher, and the teacher is never kind, was to exist in a constant state of improvisation. Every path through the forest was a gamble. Every meal a temporary answer to a larger, unanswered question. How much longer could this go on? In those conditions, survival was not a destination. It was a rhythm, fragile and relentless, carried out one day at a time, and even when the land gave back, it did not give evenly. A sudden thaw might bring new growth to one valley, while another remained locked in frost. A herd might graze safely in one region while famine gripped the next. For the scattered groups of early humans, such patchiness could be the difference between continuity and extinction. Those who happened to be near an overlooked refuge, a spring-fed stream, a forest edge, a cave that faced just the right way stood a better chance. Survival, then, was not only about effort or ingenuity, it was also about luck. But luck, on its own, does not build memory. What does endure are the strategies forged under pressure. Knowledge passed not as words carved in stone, but as habits, instincts, quiet rituals, which roots to boil, which winds carry the scent of prey, which caves stay dry through the winter. These fragments of practical wisdom, repeated over generations, formed the invisible spine of survival. In some places, the archaeological record hints at social reorganization. Sites show multiple hearths clustered close together, suggesting groups temporarily merging perhaps to share resources or to wait out a hard season. Elsewhere we find unusual burials, a child laid beside an elder, or a single body placed with care in a cave wall. These are not acts of pure necessity. They are gestures of meaning, carried out even when energy was scarce. They tell us that even in times of famine, people still made space for memory. And perhaps this is the deepest clue of all. Hunger does not erase humanity. If anything, it distills it. In the most fragile circumstances, what endures is not only the will to eat, but the will to care. To share when you have almost nothing. To teach a child how to chew a root slowly, to sing while waiting for a snare to catch, to wrap a body before the soil freezes too hard to dig. These moments, invisible to history but written into bones, are part of why anyone remains at all. So the final question of this chapter is not about what the bones tell us. It is about what they cannot say. How many acts of kindness went unrecorded? How many moments of shared bread or firelight passed without a trace and yet, somehow, made all the difference? Even after all that was lost, the food, the shelter, the certainty of seasons, something still endured. Across thousands of years of grinding cold and chronic scarcity, a thin thread of humanity held fast. But what that thread actually looked like, what it meant to survive in such diminished numbers, is only now coming into focus, and what it reveals is staggering. Through the lens of genetics, we now know that the Ice Age was not just a test of endurance, it was a bottleneck, a narrowing of the human lineage so severe that nearly all branches were clipped away, leaving behind a single fragile stem from which we are all descended. The evidence lives in our DNA. When scientists sequenced the genomes of modern humans across different populations, they found signs of extreme reduction in genetic diversity at certain points in the deep past. One of the most dramatic of these occurred somewhere between 900,000 and 800,000 years ago. Based on mutation rates and inheritance patterns, some estimates suggest that the total global population of ancestral humans may have dropped to as few as 1,200 individuals or fewer. This wasn't a one-time collapse. The genetic data indicate that this reduction persisted for tens of thousands of years. It was not a single disaster, like a volcano or a famine, but a prolonged state of fragility. Humanity lived on a knife's edge, not in one place, but across its entire range. Why it happened, exactly, remains a puzzle. Climate instability was certainly part of it. The Earth was locked into a glacial phase, with wild oscillations between wet and dry, cold and colder. These shifts would have broken apart ecosystems, fragmented habitats, and made migration perilous. In many regions, food sources became unreliable. In others, rising aridity or deepening frost made them vanish altogether. But some scientists also suggest that competition played a role not necessarily with predators, but with other human-like species. Homo erectus, for instance, had already spread widely across Africa and Asia. These populations may have been numerous, but not well adapted to the rapidly changing climates. If they died out while smaller, more adaptable groups persisted, the genetic record would show a sharp contraction and narrowing gate through which only a few could pass. This moment in evolutionary history is known as a genetic bottleneck, and it functions much like the name suggests. A wide and diverse population enters, but only a few make it through. Everything that follows all modern humans, all culture, language, memory, flows from that narrow passage. So the essential mystery becomes this: how did any humans make it through at all? And what set them apart, if not strength in numbers? It's tempting to picture a single event, a drought, a volcanic eruption, a disease that caused this great reduction, but the truth is likely more complex and more prolonged. The Ice Age didn't squeeze humanity through its narrow gate in a single winter. It did so over thousands of years, tightening the margins slowly, until only the most adaptable, most fortunate, or most connected remained. And still, the fact that anyone remained at all feels improbable. A global population of just over 1,000 is smaller than many modern villages. At that size, a single bad decade, a failed migration, a sharp freeze, A conflict with a neighboring group could have meant the end. Small populations are vulnerable not only to external threats, but to internal ones: genetic drift, inbreeding, and simple bad luck. This is where DNA becomes a kind of time machine. By looking at how much genetic variation exists across modern humans today and how that variation is distributed, scientists can work backward. The pattern is consistent. A long bottleneck beginning around 900,000 years ago, stretching for tens of thousands of years, with signs of recovery only emerging much later. The technical term is effective population size, the number of individuals who are actually contributing to the next generation. The number is always lower than the total head count, because not everyone reproduces, and not all lineages survive. But even accounting for that, the signal is stark. For tens of millennia, human ancestors were reduced to a level of diversity that suggests a single extended family line clinging to existence. Where these people lived is still debated. Some hypotheses point to isolated ecological refuges, pockets of relative stability where food and water remained accessible, coastal regions, sheltered valleys, or highland springs that never dried up. These places may have become sanctuaries, tiny islands in a world that was increasingly hostile. Groups that settled near such refuges might have been able to endure, while others vanished with the shifting winds. We cannot name these places for certain. No single archaeological site has yet been confirmed as the home of the Bottleneck survivors, but hints appear in Eastern Africa, in parts of the Middle East, and along ancient coastlines that are now submerged. Wherever they were, these humans faced an existence of extraordinary fragility each year, a wager against the climate, each birth a hope against extinction. It raises a difficult but necessary question. How much of our story is built not on triumph, but on surviving just long enough? Perhaps the most haunting part of this story is not the idea that humanity nearly disappeared, but that we would never have known except for the silent record written into our genes. The bones can go missing, the tools can erode, but the DNA carries history forward in every cell. It does not speak in words, but in probabilities. And what it tells us is that survival was not inevitable. It was a close call, a long and trembling moment when the future hung by a thread. And that thread may have been held together by something as intangible as adaptability. Groups that made it through the bottleneck likely shared certain qualities, not just physical resilience, but behavioral flexibility. In a world of collapsing habitats and unreliable seasons, it was not the strongest who endured, but those who could switch strategies when old ones failed. We see glimmers of this in tool variability. Around this time, some regions show a diversification of flake tools and signs of new ways of working bone or wood. These changes are subtle, not technological revolutions, but quiet shifts. They suggest a willingness to experiment, to test, to rework ideas rather than cling to tradition. In desperate times, rigidity is dangerous. Adaptability, even when clumsy, keeps a group from tipping into the abyss. Social behavior may have mattered even more. With so few humans left, isolation was deadly. A single group cut off from others for too long risked genetic collapse or simple extinction through misfortune. But groups that could exchange mates, ideas, or assistance had a better chance. Mobility wasn't just about following herds, it was about maintaining fragile networks. The survivors of the bottleneck may have been those who could walk long distances not only to find food, but to find each other. This emphasis on interdependence echoes something deeper in the archaeological record: signs of care, injuries that had healed, disabled individuals who had lived past the age when they could contribute physically. These details suggest that survival was not only individual, it was communal, the smallest acts, sharing a piece of cooked root, staying awake while others slept, guiding a child's hand around a fire, may have been what kept the thread unbroken. And so, when we speak of the bottleneck, we are not just talking about population numbers or genetic variation. We are talking about moments of choice, made again and again under unimaginable pressure. The choice to stay together, the choice to keep moving, the choice to keep teaching. Even when it seemed there was no future to teach for. It's worth asking, what invisible behaviors passed through that narrow gate still echo in us today? Some echoes are faint, others unmistakable. In our biology, in our psychology, in our instincts to huddle together when the cold sets in or to offer help when someone stumbles, there may be remnants of those ancient decisions behaviors that helped our ancestors pass through that impossible narrowing. These echoes are not myths or metaphors. They are patterns, inherited not as stories, but as tendencies, shaped in part by who made it through and who did not. The bottleneck did more than reduce our numbers. It reshaped our genetic landscape. Traits that might have been rare became common, not because they were superior, but because the people who carried them happened to survive. Entire lineages disappeared. Unique genetic adaptations, languages, ways of thinking, all lost in the slow erosion of generations under pressure. What remained was not the best version of humanity, just the version that lasted. And it may have left us more vulnerable, even as it preserved us. A narrowed gene pool carries risks. Greater susceptibility to disease, reduced ability to adapt to new environments, fewer variations to draw from when crisis strikes again. Modern humans carry the imprint of that contraction. Some of the health challenges we face today, from autoimmune conditions to certain inherited disorders, may be downstream effects of this ancient reduction in diversity. Yet the most remarkable thing is that we came back. Sometime after this prolonged bottleneck, perhaps 100,000 years later, human populations began to expand again. Slowly at first, then more rapidly. The reasons are still being explored. Shifts in climate may have opened up new corridors of migration. Technological advances may have made hunting more efficient or foraging more productive. Social structures may have evolved to better support child rearing or resource sharing. Whatever the reason, the thread did not only endure, it thickened, it split and diverged and populated the continents once more. But the memory of that narrowing remains written in us not as a conscious memory, but as a deep genetic and emotional imprint. The cautiousness with which we form social bonds, the persistent human fear of scarcity, the protective impulse toward children and the elderly, these may not be mere cultural quirks. They may be traces of a time when every person counted, when every small gesture shaped the odds of survival for a group skating the edge of extinction. And so we are left with a quiet realization that the life we take for granted, the abundance, the networks, the safety in numbers, is not how it has always been. We are the descendants of a fragile recovery, the children of a near loss. So the question arises, if we all come from that one narrow gate, what do we owe to the ones who passed through it? What we owe them, perhaps, is not just remembrance, but recognition. The recognition that our very existence, our thoughts, our languages, the shape of our hands, traces back to a line of survivors who had every reason to disappear, but didn't. They endured not because the world was kind to them, but because they found ways, however imperfect, to outlast what was meant to end them. And this endurance, by its nature, was not heroic in the grand cinematic sense. It was not marked by battles or great inventions. It was quiet, local, and deeply human. A parent calming a hungry child with a piece of softened root. A band staying one more week in a barren valley, hoping the rains would return. A woman binding a broken ankle with woven grass, not knowing whether help would come. These were the decisions that held open the gate barely, but long enough. If the world were fair, we would know their names. We would have carvings of their faces or stories of their migrations. But we don't. All we have are the clues they left behind, genetic patterns, scattered tools, and the long pause in our ancestry where it seems we almost ceased to be. And yet, in that pause, there is something sacred. A kind of evolutionary silence, during which only a few voices whispered on, and from those whispers came us. We now know, with increasing precision, just how thin the thread was. Population reconstructions based on coalescent models which estimate how long ago all our lineages converge show a dramatic flattening of human diversity. Even today, the entire human species is less genetically varied than a single group of chimpanzees living in one forest. That is the lasting imprint of the bottleneck. Not just that we almost vanished, but that we never fully recovered what was lost. Still, what emerged from that narrowing was not empty. It was concentrated, focused. What survived was not only genetic material, but social strategies, patterns of cooperation, and cognitive flexibility that would go on to define us. In that fragile time, the foundations were laid for memory, culture, language, and maybe even empathy. The great ordeal of the Ice Age did not end with that bottleneck. It would stretch on for hundreds of thousands of years more. But something shifted in this phase. The odds had bent low, but had not broken us. A tiny population scattered across uncertain ground had managed to maintain enough continuity, enough care to carry life forward. And so the final question of this chapter is not about numbers or genes. It is more intimate than that. When you are the product of those who barely made it, what will you choose to carry, and what might you still pass through the next narrow gate? You carry forward the memory of fragility and step into a land that appears, at first, to offer nothing. There are no forests here, no sheltering trees, no towering cliffs or fertile river deltas. Only an endless expanse of wind-scoured plains, rolling gently from one frozen horizon to the next. And yet, this vast, treeless domain would become a lifeline, both perilous and life-giving. It was called the Mammoth Steppe. Spanning from Western Europe across Siberia and into the icy margins of North America, this biome was one of the most expansive ecosystems ever to exist. It was cold, yes, but not glaciated. Dry, but not desert. The soil, frozen in winter and thawed just enough in summer, supported a grassland of surprising richness. Hardy sedges, low shrubs, and deep-rooted grasses covered the land, a patchwork of muted colour, golden in autumn, silver in winter, forever in motion under the wind. This steppe was not empty. It pulsed with life. Towering woolly mammoths moved in slow herds across the open spaces. Their massive tusks curved like moons, their shaggy coats catching the low Sunday time. Bison by the thousands thundered through the snow, their hooves carving new paths into the permafrost. Giant elk, woolly rhinoceroses, wild horses, cave lions, wolves and hyenas all found their place in this frozen theatre of survival. For human ancestors emerging from the genetic bottleneck, the Mammoth Steppe was a paradox. It could nourish them, and it could destroy them. There was food here in extraordinary abundance, but only for those who could reach it. There was no fruit to pluck, no nuts to gather. There were only animals, massive, dangerous animals. And so, to live here was to become a hunter or to die. But what a landscape to be reborn into! The open plain demanded vision, patience, and cooperation. It offered no hiding places, so stealth had to take new forms. It was not enough to crawl behind a tree or drop from a ledge. Here, strategy meant circling with the wind, waiting for the right snowdrift, coordinating across distances. The steppe was not a land that could be conquered, only adapted to, slowly, in careful movements. And still, those who learned its rhythms found something rare. Predictability. Unlike forests that could be stripped or rivers that might dry, the Mammoth Steppe remained relatively stable across long spans of time. The herds followed the same general paths year after year. The seasons, though brutal, came in rhythm. Those who listened to the land, who watched the hooves and measured the wind, could begin to plan not just for the day, but for the seasons ahead. It is here, in this cold expanse, that the next phase of the human journey begins, not in retreat, but in pursuit. To hunt on the Mammoth Steppe was to enter a world of giants, not just in size, but in consequence. These animals were not incidental meals. A single mammoth could feed a band for weeks. A bison herd, if successfully routed, meant enough meat, hide, tendon, and fat to last through the worst of winter. But the risk was just as vast. The woolly rhinoceros, armoured with muscle and temper, could gore a person in seconds. Even a frightened horse, when cornered, could trample a careless hunter. This was not opportunistic scavenging. It was strategy, coordination, and above all, Courage. At sites like Dolní Věstonice and Předmostí, archaeologists have found the remains of large-scale hunts, accumulations of mammoth bones arranged in circular patterns, suggesting not random dispersal, but deliberate activity. Some researchers interpret these as the remains of dwellings built from bones and hides. Others see them as communal processing areas, where meat was stripped, fat rendered, sinew dried. Either way, the message is clear. Humans were not simply surviving here, they were establishing a rhythm of life around these immense animals. Hunting a mammoth was not a solitary act. It required planning, scouting, and a shared understanding of terrain. Groups may have used snowbanks or frozen rivers to trap or slow their quarry. Spears tipped with stone points sharpened and fire-hardened were coordinated into volleys. Fires may have been used to steer herds, forcing them toward ambush sites. All of this implies not just intelligence, but social intelligence, the ability to communicate, assign roles, and adapt mid-hunt. And the stakes were always high. A failed hunt could leave a group empty-handed, injured, or worse. A misstep might startle the herd too soon, scatter the animals, or invite a deadly counterattack. So knowledge became as valuable as tools. Children likely grew up learning to read wind, to watch for herd movements, to memorize the timing of migrations. Songs, rituals, or spoken memory may have encoded this information, passed down like maps written in rhythm and breath. These animals were more than food. They were the backbone of life on the steppe. Mammoth bones were carved into tools, shelters, even figurines. Bison hides became clothing and drums. Sinew became thread. Fat was rendered into fuel. Nothing was wasted. And because of this intimacy, these animals were likely honored, not worshipped in a modern sense, but acknowledged in death, marked by gestures that blur the line between utility and reverence. To live among the giants of the Ice Age was to step into an ancient relationship, not only predator and prey, but co-survivors in a difficult world. The humans who walked these plains did not dominate them. They moved within their currents, learning to draw strength from the very forces that could destroy them. And in doing so, they began to weave themselves into the ecology of the steppe, not as rulers, but as students. For those who adapted to the mammoth steppe, survival became a choreography, a series of movements repeated across seasons, refined across generations. But unlike instinct, which is hardwired, this choreography had to be learned. It required teaching, remembering, and most of all, innovating. As the challenges deepened, so did the responses. This is where the human story begins to shift from adaptation to invention. Tool-making changed. The stone flakes of earlier times evolved into composite tools, hafted spears, bone-tipped projectiles, finely retouched blades. At sites like Kostenki and Sungir, evidence emerges of advanced craftsmanship, bone needles, ivory carvings, intricate ornaments. These objects speak not only of survival, but of abstraction, planning, and a growing aesthetic sense. It wasn't enough to kill and carve. People began to shape the world with intention, but tools were only part of the equation. The real innovation was social. To thrive here, where food came in waves, where the weather turned violently, where resources had to be shared or lost required a deepening of cooperation, bands likely grew larger, or at least more flexible. Information was shared between groups, not guarded. Fireplaces were arranged communally. Food caches were protected. Hunting became an orchestrated act of timing and trust. Such cooperation did not come easily. It required ways to resolve tension, to reward generosity, to reinforce bonds. The origins of culture, music, ritual, symbolic art may find some of their earliest roots in these frozen gatherings. Around the fire, knowledge was not only exchanged, it was shaped. A shared story could coordinate action better than shouts on the field. A gesture, a mark in the snow, a song of the mammoth's path. These were tools too, and as this social technology evolved, so did resilience. A group with strong internal cohesion could survive, where a looser one might fall apart. Those who knew how to care for the injured, to wait for the young, to mourn the dead. Without halting the hunt, they carried forward more than just genes. They carried meaning. Even shelter began to reflect this shift. Structures made of mammoth bone and hide, arranged in circles or spirals, suggest intentional design not just for warmth, but for living together. Entrances faced prevailing winds. Hearths were placed to heat the interior evenly. These choices tell us that people were thinking in systems, not just reacting to the cold, but anticipating it. They were designing against it. And in this crucible of cold and cooperation, something quietly monumental was happening. The human mind was not just reacting to its environment, it was beginning to shape it. In the steppe, necessity gave birth to ingenuity, and ingenuity in turn created space for something new, imagination. Imagination, once sparked, does not stay still. In the vast openness of the Mammoth Steppe, where the sky pressed down and the wind never stopped, the human mind stretched outward, reaching into realms that had no immediate survival value, but offered something deeper. Meaning, orientation, continuity. For in a landscape where the ground itself could freeze solid and vanish all trace of yesterday's camp, memory had to find new anchors. So, humans began carving those anchors into bone, into ivory, into each other's minds. Some of the earliest known figurines come from this time. Tiny representations of animals, humans, and hybrid forms, not just practical but expressive. A mammoth etched into a piece of tusk. A woman with exaggerated features shaped from soft stone. These were not tools in the usual sense. They were ideas made tangible. Symbols. Stories. Perhaps offerings. Perhaps memories of hunts or ancestors. Whatever their purpose, they mark a turning point. The ability to imagine something that is not present, and to give it form. This was not mere decoration. In the context of Ice Age survival, symbolic thinking was adaptive. It allowed knowledge to be stored not just in bodies, but in culture, in songs, in signs, in shared images that could outlast any one person. You could teach a child how to make a spear, yes, but you could also teach them why the hunt matters, what to say before it begins, where to bury the bones. These patterns of behavior, layered with emotion and meaning, became early traditions flexible, memorable, and capable of transmitting complex information without writing. Language itself may have deepened here. Not invented from silence, but expanded more nuance, more abstraction, more ability to describe things unseen. Perhaps words were invented to describe tools, but perhaps others were born in the moments around the fire, trying to name something lost or something hoped for. All of this, the cooperation, the symbols, the rituals, wove a net across the vastness of the steppe, a net of shared meaning, keeping people tethered to each other across distance and time. Without it, the openness might have been unbearable. The treeless plain does not cradle you, it exposes you. But a story can become shelter. A name spoken for the dead can become a map through grief. A remembered song can become a rhythm for walking. In this way, humans didn't just survive the Mammoth Steppe. They became part of it not as outsiders scraping by, but as agents of continuity, as beings capable of anchoring meaning in a land that offered no permanence. And slowly, over generations, the open steppe began to mirror the growing complexity of the mind that moved across it. Across the wind-brushed plains of the Mammoth Steppe, something subtle but profound was happening. The humans who moved through this landscape, who tracked the herds, shaped the tools, and remembered the stories were becoming more than survivors. They were becoming architects of continuity. In a world that changed with every sunrise, they had begun to build something that could last. That lasting thing wasn't a monument or a city. It was a pattern, a way of life resilient enough to weather both the cruelty of the Ice Age and the fragility of small communities. Every hunt was a lesson, every migration route a memory, and every fire lit against the cold was a statement, we are still here. But the Mammoth Steppe gave as much as it demanded. The very harshness of the land, its lack of shelter, its unrelenting exposure, forced a kind of innovation that may not have emerged elsewhere. Here, planning was not optional. Here, community was not a luxury. Here, success could not be hoarded, it had to be shared, or it was lost. These were not just adaptations, they were values, shaped by necessity and etched into behavior. Even the relationship with the animals began to reflect this layered understanding. Mammoths were no longer just meat, they were teachers. Their movement dictated human movement. Their bones became shelters. Their stories, perhaps, became myths. In this, the humans of the steppe began to see their world not as a collection of separate pieces, but as an interconnected whole one, in which their actions had consequence, memory, and rhythm. And from that recognition came something rarer still: foresight. The ability to look at a distant herd and see not only food, but the shape of the coming winter. The ability to teach children not just how to throw a spear, but why to wait and when to act. The mammoth steppe did not reward haste, it rewarded patience and the slow mastery of moving parts. This is the legacy of those who lived in that immense, wind-torn world. They left no written records, no cities of stone, but they left something far more enduring, a model of life built not on domination but on listening, to the herds, to the wind, to each other. When the climate shifted once again, when the ice receded, the grasses faded, and the great animals dwindled, the people who had mastered the steppe did not vanish. They moved. They carried their knowledge forward into new biomes and new challenges. But something of the open plain remained in them, in us. Even now, when we walk across fields or feel the wind pressing at our backs, we carry an echo of that old horizon, a memory shaped not by walls, but by movement, not by conquest, but by persistence. And that memory, sharpened by cold, softened by firelight, still lives in the deep architecture of the human soul. You carry the wind of the mammoth steppe in your bones, but when the sun slips behind the horizon and the sky turns black with cold, it is not the hunt you think of, it is the fire. Because in the vast silence of prehistoric nights, fire was more than a flickering light. It was a promise, a perimeter of warmth, a gathering place, a way to make the dark less endless. Long before cities, before temples or laws, there was fire burning at the center of human life. And while lightning may have struck dry grass for millions of years, what mattered most was not the flame itself, but what humans learned to do with it. The oldest signs of controlled fire date back over 1 million years, scattered across Africa and parts of Eurasia. Charred bones, blackened sediments, and heat-altered tools found at sites like Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel or Kubi Fora in Kenya offer glimpses of ancient flame handling. But these early fires were likely opportunistic, brief, unsteady, dependent on nature's timing. What changed was not just the use of fire, but the ability to keep it alive. Eventually, humans began to carry embers between camps, to guard the coals through storms, to build shelters with dedicated hearths. This transition from fire as a lucky event to fire as a maintained companion marks one of the most pivotal shifts in human history. It meant warmth on demand, cooked food, protection from predators, light long after the sun had gone. But something else happened too. Fire changed what nights could be. With flame came pause. The day no longer ended when the sky darkened. Around the fire, people could rest, reflect, speak. The flickering light extended the realm of consciousness, offering time for memory, imagination, and shared thought. In the chaos of Ice Age winters where every calorie counted, this was no small thing. Sitting still without freezing required fire, and fire gave stillness a shape. It also gave safety. In a world of cave lions and night-stalking hyenas, a burning perimeter could make the difference between life and death. But perhaps more importantly, it created a center, a place to gather, a point around which the social body could form. Even when food was scarce, the fire was a kind of wealth, and those who tended it, kept it, and shared it likely gained status in ways no spear ever could. The fire made community possible, but it also made something else: reflection. As the flames danced and shadows played across bone and hide, stories may have been born. Not just recitations of hunts, but inventions. The mind freed from immediate danger wandered, and in that wandering, something distinctly human took shape. So the fire was not just fuel, it was a frame, a space where time stretched, voices softened, and meaning began to glow. Around the fire, the body softened, and so did the food. The discovery that meat cooked over flame was not only tastier, but easier to chew and digest, marked a subtle but vital turn in human evolution. Cooking transformed more than flavor. It transformed biology. By pre-digesting nutrients, it allowed the body to extract more energy from the same amount of food. Some researchers believe this change freed up caloric resources that could be redirected toward the growth of the brain. But it wasn't just about meat, tubers, roots, and tough plants. Staples of ancient diets became edible once roasted. Dangerous toxins in certain foods were broken down by heat. Parasites hiding in raw flesh were neutralized. In this way, fire became a kind of internal filter, a barrier between the raw world and the vulnerable gut. It didn't just warm bodies, it protected them from within. And this had consequences for health, not just survival, but thriving. The shift to cooked diets may have reduced wear on teeth, lowered the risk of infection, and allowed people to spend less time chewing, more time observing, moving, remembering. Over generations, this gradual release of time and energy may have reshaped the rhythm of life itself. There's also evidence that fire allowed early humans to inhabit colder regions more fully, not just as short-term visitors, but as permanent residents. Sites like Terra Amata in France and Jukudian in China suggest consistent use of fire in regions far from the equator, long before modern Homo sapiens arrived. This implies more than occasional success, it implies mastery. The hearth, then, was not a novelty. It was a technology, a transformative one. It extended the human range, expanded the menu, softened the night, and made time itself more spacious. But its influence didn't stop at the edge of the skin. It moved into the social sphere. Consider the ritual of sharing cooked food, a gesture that still binds people today. The passing of meat from hand to hand, the waiting while something sizzles, the smell that draws everyone inward. These are not just biological reactions, they are social instincts, shaped across tens of thousands of fires. Around the hearth, people learn to wait, to take turns, to offer. Generosity, a trait so central to human communities, may have been reinforced by the structure of the meal. And with every bite, a story was absorbed. Who found the animal? Who set the trap? Who first saw the smoke? These tales didn't need to be invented, they arose naturally, wrapped around the food like invisible seasoning. The fire didn't just cook the meal, it cooked the memory. And through that slow, warm alchemy, the line between body and mind began to blur. What entered the stomach also entered the soul. In the glow of the fire, stories gained shape, and so did identity. For while tools were made in daylight, and animals tracked across frozen ridges, the hearth belonged to another rhythm entirely. It was the rhythm of pause, of presence, of repetition, a place not just for warmth or food, but for witnessing one another. And in that witnessing, something ancient stirred, the sense of belonging. To sit in the circle of flame was to be seen. It was a space where the face became illuminated, where the voice carried evenly, where silence could fall without fear. Children watched the flicker of light move across the faces of elders. Lovers sat close under the shadows of mammoth hides. Wounds were inspected, plans were debated. Laughter rare and precious echoed like music. The fire was not just central to the camp, it was central to the mind. Archaeological sites across Europe and Asia show repeated use of hearths at the heart of human dwellings, carefully arranged, often reused, sometimes even marked with ochre or stone. The circle was not arbitrary. It created orientation toward the center, toward each other. And in this arrangement, the human psyche found a new tool: reflection. At the edge of firelight, thoughts lingered longer, images held steady, words began to stretch beyond the immediate into memory, into dream, into the territory of what if. It's here that ritual may have first emerged. Not as religion, but as rhythm, the repeated motion of feeding the flames, the practice of setting stones in a ring, the careful placement of burnt offerings. These acts need no priest to be sacred. They become sacred through their constancy, a comfort not just to the body, but to the soul. Imagine a winter night, somewhere on the Mammoth Steppe, a storm howling beyond the hide walls, the wind carving lines into snowdrifts, and inside, a circle of people, hands outstretched, eyes half-lidded with sleep, listening to a voice that tells not just what happened today, but what happened long ago, or what may yet come. In this moment, fire is no longer just an element. It becomes a portal, a companion, a mirror. It draws stories out of the bones. It invites the impossible to feel real. Even the flicker itself, the movement of light and shadow, may have inspired some of the earliest symbolic thinking. The first cave paintings may have been seen not under sun, but by torchlight, their figures seeming to move as the flame danced. In this way, fire didn't just light the world, it animated it. And so, deep in the dark, with breath misting in the cold and mammoth fat crackling in the fire, a new kind of life began. One where time stretched further than memory, and warmth became something more than heat. As the fire crackled on through the long night, it came to define not just the moment, but the rhythm of life itself. Days were shaped by motion, the hunt, the foraging, the movement between camps. But night belonged to stillness, and stillness belonged to the flame. It was here that the mind could wander inward, and as it wandered, it stitched connections between the living and the dead, between memory and dream, between the cold world outside and the imagined one within. It's possible that some of the earliest human philosophies were not born in caves or rituals, but beside the hearth. Not spoken as declarations, but whispered as wonder. Why do the flames rise? Where do the sparks go? Why does the wood die with light? These questions had no fixed answers, and yet they mattered. They drew the mind outward. They gave shape to the invisible, and fire, unlike any other element, invited intimacy with the unknown. You could not stare into the wind. You could not cup the river's current in your hands. But fire looked back. It moved like breath. It responded. It gave warmth when fed, and silence when neglected. It burned, yes, but it also danced. It was both tool and companion, both feared and adored. In this duality, it became a symbol, perhaps the first, a representation of life and death, of danger and safety, of light and dark. These opposites, embodied in one glowing presence, may have offered early humans their first lessons in paradox, and it's no surprise that later myths from distant cultures across the globe so often describe fire as a gift from gods, or a stolen secret, or a sacred punishment. Even then, long after the Ice Age, people remembered its mystery. But in the deep past, fire's magic was not just in myth, it was practical, constant, essential. Hearths were tended with care, sometimes maintained for days, weeks, even longer. The person who kept the coals alive, who could coax flame from ash, or carry embers between camps, may have been revered. Their role wasn't just technical, it was spiritual. They carried not only warmth, but continuity. And as the hearths multiplied, so did their meanings. In larger groups, multiple fires might burn side by side, some for cooking, others for crafting, still others reserved for quiet. In some sites, ashes were buried with the dead. In others, burnt bone fragments suggest offerings, or perhaps attempts to communicate with something beyond. We'll never know for certain what was felt, but the gestures, layered and deliberate, point to a growing inner world. A world in which survival was no longer enough, because as fire shaped the body and extended the day, it also stretched the soul, teaching it to see, to wonder, and to remember. What does it mean to gather around a fire, knowing that the warmth you feel is older than memory, that the flames licking upward echo those tended by hands long turned to dust hands that shaped your ancestors' nights in the same circle of light and hush? Fire was never just a tool. It was a continuity, a thread that linked generations not through blood alone, but through practice, presence, and the quiet language of gathering. Even now, in our modern world of artificial light and silent switches, the allure of a flame remains. We are drawn to it, to candles, to campfires, to hearths that flicker in dark rooms. We call it ambience, nostalgia, comfort. But beneath that softness lies something deeper. Recognition. A return. The body remembers what the mind forgets. It remembers how to lean toward warmth, how to listen when voices fall quiet, how to mark time in the rhythm of burning wood. This memory is older than writing. It predates the first carvings, the first symbols, the first myths. It is encoded not in books, but in instinct, in the way children stare into firelight without instruction, in the way silence becomes meaningful when shared in a circle. And it is here, in this fragile arena of flickering light, that human imagination found its earliest sanctuary. Before temples and altars, there was this. The glowing coal, the soft murmur of breath, the glint of thought behind eyes reflecting flame. The fire did not teach us what to believe. It gave us space in which belief could form. So when we speak of fire as survival, we are telling only part of the story. Yes, it cooked our food. Yes, it protected us from predators, but it also slowed time. It encouraged listening. It offered a frame in which language could become memory, and memory could become myth. And through that myth, something remarkable happened, the birth of a shared inner world. Not just individual experience, but collective meaning. Not just endurance, but culture. Around the fire, humans began to carry more than tools. They began to carry ideas. Perhaps this is why fire still holds a place in our deepest symbols, why it marks rituals, frames celebrations, and honors the dead. It is not the flame itself we revere, it is what it allows us to become. In the Ice Age, fire was a revolution, quiet, constant, and transformative. It lit the darkness, warmed the blood, softened the meal, but above all, it drew us inward and toward each other, and in its light, the long night no longer seemed so endless. What does it mean to know you are not alone, that across the same snow-covered horizon, other eyes are watching, other hands are shaping stone, other fires are burning? In the long human story, the idea of uniqueness is recent. For most of our existence, we shared the world with others like us, not animals, not strangers, but kin, different yet familiar, separate yet parallel. And during the depths of the Ice Age, these rival species walked the same frozen trails. The most famous among them are the Neanderthals, broad-shouldered, barrel-chested, and astonishingly resilient. They lived across Europe and Western Asia, adapting to the cold with powerful bodies and ingenious tools. Their skulls, heavy-browed and elongated, housed brains as large or larger than our own. For hundreds of thousands of years, they endured the same glacial climates, stalked the same prey, and shaped their own traditions. To the east, another group emerged, the Denisovans. Known mostly through a scattering of genetic traces and fragments of bone, their story remains half-told, but no less intriguing. They left behind tools, ornaments, and the echo of their DNA, not just in modern Asians and Pacific Islanders, but in the mystery of their migration. How far did they travel? What did they build? What dreams did they chase across the steppe? Even further back, the shadow of Homo erectus still lingered, the pioneers of the genus Homo, whose long history stretched back over 1 million years. They had crossed continents, adapted to forests and savannas, and perhaps even built the first fires. By the time modern humans appeared, these ancestors were already legends etched in the land. But the Ice Age was not spacious. It was constricted, a world of narrow corridors and shifting frontiers. And as glaciers advanced and retreated, so too did populations. The paths of these species overlapped. near river valleys, along coastal plains, across dry steppe corridors where game was plentiful. And with that overlap came something inevitable: contact. What form did it take? Were they strangers who kept their distance, marked by different smells, gestures, and sounds? Or did curiosity pull them closer? We may never know the first meetings, but their consequences are written in us. Modern humans carry Neanderthal DNA. Some carry Denisovan genes. These are not metaphors. They are inheritances, traces of encounters that were more than violent, more than fleeting. Still, questions linger. If these species were so capable, so intelligent, so adaptable, why are they gone? The Ice Age did not just test individuals, it tested cultures, lifeways, flexibility. And as the climate shifted, so too did the rules of survival. Some groups adapted, others endured for a time and then faded. But for a while, the world was not ours alone. We were one voice among many, sharing the cold, the firelight, and perhaps even the same ancient dreams. How do you measure closeness in the shape of a hand axe or in the warmth of a shared fire? Across Eurasia, long before boundaries or nations existed, the Ice Age drew overlapping paths, not lines of division, but tangled routes of convergence. When we trace these ancient migrations, we are not following a straight story, but a braided river. Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps others whose names we've yet to discover. All moving, all adapting, all reaching forward into an uncertain world. In caves from France to Siberia, archaeologists have unearthed similar tools made by different species. Levallois flakes, shaped with startling precision, appear in both Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens sites. Bone points, beads, and ornaments blur the line between origin and imitation. Were these parallel inventions? Or signs of contact, influence, learning? Did a Neanderthal watch a sapiens nap a finer blade and try it for himself? Did a Denisovan child hold a carved pendant and wonder where it came from? The tools are clues not just of survival but of shared logic. They show that different human groups face the same problems. How to butcher a carcass cleanly. How to sew hides. How to make a home from what the land would give. And in solving those problems, they sometimes landed on the same answers. But behind those convergences lies a deeper question. If we make the same tools, tell similar stories, walk the same paths, are we truly separate? Or are we fragments of the same fire, burning in different corners of the same dark world? Because when the evidence is laid bare in stratified layers of ash, in the subtle curve of a flint edge, in the careful alignment of hearths along a rock wall, the distinctions begin to blur. What separates a Neanderthal shelter from a sapiens one, when both face the same wind, both guard against the same predators, both hold the same quiet need for warmth? And yet, even in these overlaps, traces of uniqueness remain. Neanderthals seem to prefer close-range hunting, relying on strength and coordination. Homo sapiens, with lighter builds, crafted finer projectiles for long-distance strikes. Denisovans, in the limited record we have, left behind surprisingly complex artifacts, suggesting minds tuned to nuance, to craft, to patience. There is no simple ladder here, no clean hierarchy, only variations of body, of strategy, of imagination. In the end, perhaps it was not about who was more intelligent or more adapted, but who was more flexible. Who could shift as the environment shifted? Who could form broader alliances, navigate larger social webs, carry knowledge not just across years, but across landscapes? Still, when they stood face to face, if they did, what did they see? A rival? A mirror? Or something more difficult? The unfamiliar made familiar, the other made kin? In the frozen corridors of the Pleistocene world, the presence of other human species wasn't just an occasional fact, it was a condition of life. Long before modern humans came to dominate the Earth, we were simply one lineage among many, moving through a shared landscape shaped by necessity, creativity, and cold. For thousands of years, the world was not a monologue, but a chorus, different voices, different strategies, all tuned to the same harsh climate. What passed between these groups when they met? suspicion, recognition, or something more quietly human. One of the most profound revelations in modern genetics is the confirmation that we did not replace our cousins without trace, we absorbed them. Nearly all non-African people carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. Populations in Southeast Asia and Oceania carry even more from the elusive Denisovans. These aren't faint echoes. They are instructions embedded in every cell. Living legacies of encounters long past. But what do those encounters mean? Were they violent, cooperative, fleeting, intimate? The evidence, as always, is incomplete. But there are clues. Some Neanderthal sites show repeated occupation alongside anatomically modern humans, separate hearths in the same cave, toolkits with mixed features, or similar burial practices. These suggest moments of overlap, times when borders blurred, if only briefly, and in those overlaps, knowledge may have moved. Perhaps a Neanderthal child learned how to pressure flake a sharper blade from a Homo sapiens elder. Perhaps a woman from one group taught another how to soften, hide, or identify edible roots. Even if words were not shared, gestures would have been. Curiosity travels across species more easily than we think. Still, the end of the story is silence. Neanderthals disappear from the record around 40 years ago. Denisovans vanish even earlier, known now only from fragments and DNA. The reasons are debated: climate collapse, smaller population sizes, lower reproductive success, or perhaps simply bad luck. There is little evidence of open conflict. More often, it appears these lineages simply dwindled, replaced not by violence, but by the slow pressure of change. And yet, something of them endures. Not just in genomes, but in memory. We look at their tools, their bones, the quiet care shown in their burials, and we recognize something not ourselves, exactly, but something close, something kindred. And that closeness stirs an unsettling thought. If they were so much like us, why did we survive, and they did not? The hearth was not the only place where ideas passed quietly between species. In the open landscapes of Ice Age, Europe and Asia, migration routes became braided with movement, memory, and shared adaptation. As climates shifted and ecosystems evolved, human groups, whether Neanderthal, Denisovan, or Homo sapiens, were forced to follow the rhythms of game, water, and shelter. Along these paths, the footprints of different peoples often crisscrossed, and in that convergence, knowledge may have flowed in subtle currents. How much of our survival was truly ours, and how much was borrowed, copied, or quietly inherited? Some archaeological sites point toward this delicate exchange. In the Châtel-Perronian layers of France and northern Spain, Neanderthal tools take on characteristics long associated with Homo sapiens: finer blades, pierced ornaments, the use of bone and ivory. At the same time, early sapiens in Europe seem to adopt certain tool-making strategies more typical of Neanderthals. It is not clear who taught whom, or whether these innovations emerged independently, but the implication is clear. Innovation does not belong to one lineage alone. This pattern of overlapping technology is echoed in Central and Southern Asia, where Denisovan DNA survives most strongly in present-day people, but their archaeological presence remains elusive. Some tools in these regions show advanced craftsmanship with no clear attribution. And so, the mystery deepens. Were there more groups than we've identified? Lost branches of the human family, known only through the techniques they left behind? It's worth noting that Homo erectus too had a long and sophisticated run, though their last known populations died out in places like Java, perhaps 100 years ago. Their legacy may still ripple through other lineages, in tool traditions, in adaptations to landscape, perhaps even in memory. We tend to imagine extinct humans as primitive, as stagnant, but this says more about our storytelling than their reality. To survive for over 1 million years is not the mark of failure, and yet, survival alone is not the same as continuation. The world began to shift in ways that favored flexibility, not just physical, but cultural. Homo sapiens, with their broader range of social structures, may have been better suited to maintain knowledge across greater distances and generations. Language, myth, and ritual could serve as glue in times of rupture. When a valley froze or a species vanished, it was not just tools that mattered, but the ability to imagine something beyond the immediate. Still, in the middle of this layered inheritance, the question lingers. What did we carry forward without knowing, and what did we leave behind that we'll never recover? For a time, the Ice Age world held multiple answers to the question of what it meant to be human. Not one path, but many. Not one form, but several, each shaped by its own climate, its own culture, its own unrecorded triumphs. Neanderthals, whose powerful frames adapted to bitter winters, hunted reindeer across the tundra. Denisovans, still half-shrouded in mystery, left behind only fragments, a tooth, a finger bone, traces of their bloodline. Homo erectus, the great wanderers, had already crossed continents by the time we arrived. And then Homo sapiens, more lightly built, more talkative, more restless. For millennia, the Earth was a shared home. Different human species moved across the same frozen landscapes, built tools from the same stones, tracked the same game. There were no maps, no borders, just the raw rhythm of ice and thaw, and the quiet pressure to adapt or disappear. And then, one by one, the others vanished. Not suddenly, not with spectacle, but slowly, like the last embers of a dying fire. In some places, they may have been outnumbered. In others, outlasted. In a few, perhaps folded into us through bonds of family, exchange, or necessity. But the result was the same. Their distinct voices, those ancient human notes, fell silent. It's easy to imagine this as victory, a clean succession from primitive to modern, from them to us. But that story is too simple and too proud. The fossil record tells a subtler tale, not of conquest but of narrowing options, of small groups becoming smaller, of changing environments demanding more than strength. They demanded imagination. Homo sapiens may have survived, not because we were stronger or smarter, but because we were more flexible, more connected, more willing to take risks, to form broader social webs, to believe in things not yet seen. We adapted our tools, our myths, our relationships, and in doing so, we moved into every corner of the world, sometimes alone, but never untouched by those who came before. Their traces linger, not just in bones or blades, but in us, in every breath, every heartbeat, every fragment of DNA that carries a whisper from another lineage. These rival humans are not truly gone. They're folded into the story we now carry, silent partners in our long inheritance. And still, their absence remains haunting. What would it have been like to share the world with them longer? To walk beside Neanderthals in the snow? To learn from Denisovans beneath high mountain skies? To witness what their cultures might have become had they endured? Their departure made us the last humans, but not the only ones who mattered. And as we look back across the windswept plains, we must ask, if they had survived alongside us, what kind of humanity might we have become? And yet, whatever kind of humanity we might have become, the shape of our future was not only determined by those who disappeared, but by the Earth itself. Survival was never a straight path. It bent under pressure, broke beneath ash, vanished into drought. The long arc of human existence has been reshaped again and again, not just by migrations and encounters, but by catastrophe. What does it mean to carry our species forward when the world itself seems determined to start over? One of the greatest ruptures came not from a rival species or dwindling resources, but from deep beneath the ground. Around 74 years ago, Mount Toba, a supervolcano on the island of Sumatra, erupted with a force almost beyond comprehension. The blast sent ash halfway across the globe. The sky dimmed. Temperatures plunged. Crops that had not yet been invented would not have grown anyway. The climate, already unstable, faltered. In the wake of Toba, some scientists believe the global temperature may have dropped by several degrees, enough to trigger what is sometimes called a volcanic winter. Animal populations collapsed. Vegetation withered. Rain patterns shifted. It didn't matter how sharp your spear was or how clever your kin were. If the game vanished, you followed, or you didn't. To early human bands already scattered, already fragile, This was more than a disruption. It was a test of the deepest kind. Who could move? Who could adapt? Who could make it through the seasons of grey? And who would become another unmarked absence in the fossil record? And Toba was not alone. Throughout the Pleistocene, sudden environmental shocks, eruptions, droughts, rapid cooling events reshaped the map again and again. In Eastern Africa, lakes filled and emptied within generations. In Europe, forests advanced and retreated, replaced by tundra and grassland in the space of a lifetime. The world could warm or freeze within centuries or less. And always, the pattern returned. Those who adjusted survived. Those who clung too tightly to the past disappeared. The story of our ancestors is not just one of innovation or migration. It is a story of interruption, of beginnings that ended early, and endings that gave rise to unexpected resilience. And in that crucible, the question must have echoed in every huddled group beneath a darkened sky. If everything you knew about the world could vanish in a single season, what would you teach your children to remember? The generations that followed did not speak of Toba, at least not in words we can recover. No songs remain. No cave murals show the plume of ash or the long, hungry years that came after. But the impact lingers not just in soil samples and sediment cores, but in the genetic bottlenecks found in our DNA. Some researchers believe that the Toba eruption reduced the total population of Homo sapiens to just a few thousand individuals worldwide. The human story, for a time, nearly became a footnote. When the ash fell, did those who watched it believe they were witnessing the end of the world or simply another season they'd have to endure? We cannot know how many families vanished in those years. We only see what remains. Archaeological gaps in regions that were once active with toolmaking and hearths, ash layers that blanket former hunting grounds, and sudden absences in places where human ancestors once thrived. For a time, the silence in the record is almost as loud as the eruption itself. But extinction is not inevitable. Across the scattered zones of survivability, perhaps in pockets of Eastern Africa, or along stable coastlines in South Asia, small groups of humans held on. They would have relied on trust, memory, adaptability. Their tools may have changed. Their movements would have followed new patterns. The animals they hunted might have disappeared, forcing them to learn new diets, new tactics. And in those moments of pressure, small acts of invention may have defined who would live and who would fade. This is where the fossil record grows thin, but the story thickens. Humans begin to cluster more tightly around certain resources. Springs that did not dry up, coastal estuaries that continued to offer shellfish, highlands that escaped the worst of the cooling. In these regions, bands that had once wandered more widely may have drawn closer together. Social bonds would have deepened. Storytelling, ritual, and shared memory, all survival strategies in their own right, may have taken on new urgency. After catastrophe, it is not only the landscape that changes, people change too. In this time, we begin to see evidence of greater planning in toolkits. More attention to the durability of hearths, perhaps even the first stirrings of symbolic art, not as decoration, but as remembrance. A line scratched into stone, a bead buried with a child, a red ochre stain on a buried body, not proof of religion, but proof of meaning. And when survival depends on a meaning deeper than the present moment, another shift occurs. People begin to think not only about what they need, but about what they are becoming. What do you hold on to when everything around you is vanishing, and how do you know it will be enough? In the chaos that followed environmental collapse, the Earth became a puzzle, fragmented, uncertain, constantly shifting. Old migrations no longer made sense. Familiar valleys no longer gave shelter. The animals that had once been dependable vanished or moved, driven by the same unseen pressures that scattered the humans. Across this fractured world, small bands of survivors had to read a new landscape not just with their eyes, but with instinct, memory, and imagination. How do you find your way forward when even the stars seem to change? Some followed the coasts. The theory of coastal refugia suggests that after the Toba eruption and other environmental shocks, stable food sources like shellfish and seaweed offered a lifeline. Along the Indian Ocean rim, particularly in places like South Africa, archaeologists have found tools and middens, piles of shells and bones that suggest continuity even during global disruptions. These weren't bustling civilizations. They were small, mobile groups scraping survival from the tides. But they endured. Inland, the story was less stable. As rainfall patterns shifted dramatically, once fertile regions turned brittle and dry. Lakes became dust. Forests shrank into islands of green, but still, people adapted. In highland regions and caves protected from wind and storm, humans learned to store food differently, to share knowledge with greater urgency, and perhaps to band together in new ways. What they couldn't control, they learned to predict. The smell of the air before a drought, the slow fade of grass colour, the migration of birds that once sang in abundance. These signs became warnings. Warnings became stories, and stories became tools as vital as spears. Technological change during these periods wasn't always dramatic, but it became more deliberate. Composite tools made from stone, wood, and sinew began to appear. Projectiles designed for specific prey replaced the general-purpose tools of earlier generations, and with each refinement, knowledge deepened, not just of the material world, but of social coordination. It takes more than a skilled hand to build a complex tool. It takes memory, communication, and the trust to pass that knowledge down. In these pressured landscapes, the value of community likely grew. A failed hunt might mean death, unless another group shared what they had. A forgotten trail could be the difference between safety and starvation, unless someone remembered a grandmother's story. Survival began to rely on what could not be held in the hand. Memory became its own form of shelter. And yet, even in these acts of endurance, the pressure was relentless. For every group that adapted, many others were simply lost. There are no ruins to mark them, no names, no monuments, only the absence of their tools, the silence of their campsites, the broken thread in the web of ancestry. What happens to history when it leaves no trace, and how much of who we are is built on what we've already forgotten? To endure a catastrophe is not only to survive the event itself, it is to carry the memory of what came before, and to learn how to live in a world forever altered. In the aftermath of the supervolcanoes, droughts, and sudden cold snaps that reshaped the Pleistocene Earth, bands of early humans were left navigating landscapes that no longer matched their traditions. Familiar places had become dangerous. Patterns of migration, hunting, and gathering, once passed down with certainty, now unravelled under shifting skies. Yet this unravelling forced something new. Flexibility became the only constant. Groups that once lived apart began to converge around dependable resources. In cave systems like Blombos in South Africa or Jwalapuram in India, we find signs of continuity tool traditions that persist through layers of ash, evidence that some communities didn't just flee, but adapted in place. These were not large populations, but they were persistent. They suggest a kind of resilience that wasn't just physical, it was cultural. Social structures, too, may have shifted. In times of scarcity, rigid hierarchies can collapse, and egalitarian systems often become more viable. Food must be shared, risks must be taken together. Leadership becomes situational, not fixed. The ability to listen, to anticipate, to cooperate, these became survival traits as important as strength or speed. And in this crucible, human cognition itself may have sharpened. Catastrophe doesn't just thin populations, it selects for foresight. Those who could anticipate the migration of herds, the turning of weather, or the stability of a waterhole were not only more likely to survive, they were more likely to lead, and, in time, to teach. It is during this period, across multiple regions, that we begin to see more than just tools, we begin to see planning. Sites with caches of raw materials gathered in advance, specialized toolkits optimized for particular prey, hearths maintained and reused. These are not just marks of adaptation, They are signs of foresight. They show people thinking beyond the moment, beyond the season, imagining a future. That imagination may have extended into the symbolic. Red ochre, found at several sites dating to this period, may have been used in rituals, in body paint, or in burial. Beads made from shell or bone appear in multiple regions. There is no utilitarian explanation for these items. They are expressions. Perhaps they marked group identity. Perhaps they told stories. Perhaps they were offerings to unseen forces. What matters is that they were made even when food was scarce, even when the cold was deep, and this invites a quiet reflection. What kind of mind, shaped by hunger and fear, still finds space for beauty? Even as new adaptations took root in tools, in memory, in meaning, the world remained unstable. Catastrophe did not visit once and recede. It returned, again and again, in cycles of drought, ash, and chill. The Pleistocene was not a single age, but a sequence of thresholds, and each time, humanity passed through just barely, not as a conquering species, but as a scattered collection of survivors, learning how to live in a world that refused to stay still. There were no guarantees. A group that adapted brilliantly to one challenge might be undone by the next. The people of one lake basin might flourish for a few generations, then vanish when rains failed. Others might migrate inland and discover new prey, only to find themselves encircled by ice decades later. There was no steady march of progress, only moments of insight, followed by new trials. Endurance was not about advancement, it was about remaining. What threads of culture were lost in those vanished lineages? What forms of music, speech, or wisdom? We will never know. The archaeological record preserves the durable stone, bone, pigment, but not the laughter, the lullabies, the gestures that once carried love or grief. And yet, the silence itself tells a story. It tells us that culture is not a luxury of safety, it is a response to danger. People did not wait for stability to create meaning. They made meaning so they could withstand instability. This is why the echoes of those catastrophes still live in us, not just genetically, but psychologically. The memory of long winters we never lived through. The hunger for firelight. The careful attention to seasonal change. The way a landscape can feel haunted, even when we've never walked it before. These are not just instincts, they are inheritances, passed down through the long chain of those who survived. In some places, these survivors began to form larger networks. Coastal communities began trading beads and pigments across great distances. Knowledge flowed beyond kin groups. In time, this connectivity would become one of Homo sapiens' greatest strengths, not just reacting to crisis, but sharing the response. Ideas moved faster than glaciers, and with each shared solution, the burden of survival became lighter. But the Earth's unpredictability never vanished. Even now, in a world of steel and satellites, we feel its pulse, the fires, the floods, the tremors. And each time it shifts, we are reminded that our species was not shaped by control, but by resilience. The last embers of those ancient hearths may be long gone, but the warmth remains in our art, in our cooperation, in the quiet instinct to prepare for change even when things seem calm. So we're left with one final echo from that age of ash and ice. If survival is no longer the question, then what kind of life are we now responsible for making? But before we could ask what kind of life we were meant to build, we first had to survive the narrowing. There was a time distant, buried, and nearly silent in the record when the future of humanity hinged on a few thousand individuals, perhaps fewer. We do not know their names, nor the shape of their languages, nor the songs they might have sung to their children. What we do know is that they were alive when others were not. They carried forward something so fragile it could have been lost in a single season, and yet they did not let it break. In this chapter of deep time, archaeology grows quiet. Where once there were abundant tools, bones, and fires, there are now gaps. Centuries pass in some places without evidence of sustained human presence. These are not merely voids of exploration, they are absences of life. Entire bands of people may have disappeared without leaving behind more than a scattering of stone fragments or a few weathered footprints preserved in volcanic ash. And what the bones do show is harrowing. Starvation leaves its mark. We find skeletons with signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, porous bone, joints worn too early. The teeth of children especially reveal long periods without enough food. Even the marrow tells a story. In some remains, it's clear that bodies were processed thoroughly, not out of violence, but out of desperation. Nothing could be wasted. Alongside these skeletal clues, we now have another kind of record, one written not in dust, but in DNA. Geneticists have traced our ancestry back through mitochondrial lines and nuclear markers, and the pattern is stark. Somewhere between 930, 0 and 800, 0 years ago, the human lineage experienced an extreme bottleneck. The global population of our ancestors may have fallen to just a few thousand individuals, possibly fewer than 300. For over 100, 0 years, that number remained perilously low. All modern humans are descended from this sliver of survival. It's a sobering realization. We often imagine ourselves as the inevitable outcome of progress. But there was nothing guaranteed about our existence. We are here not because we were the strongest or the most numerous, but because some small number of our ancestors endured a crucible so intense it nearly erased us. And so the question shifts. When a species is reduced to a handful, scattered across a changing planet, what force, what instinct, what bond, what accident allows it to hold on? Across this thinned-out world, survival took on a different shape. It was no longer about mastering the land or expanding territory, it was about avoiding collapse, finding one more day, and passing something forward. The landscapes these people moved through had become erratic. Once, fertile valleys turned brittle, waterholes vanished between seasons, and the migration patterns of prey grew unpredictable. These survivors were not living in the margins had become all there was. In this sparse ecological theatre, small changes became decisive. A slightly more insulated shelter. A fire, better protected from wind. A social structure, flexible enough to allow rapid decisions. These were the kinds of innovations that left no dramatic traces, but shaped who lived and who didn't. And the line between those who endured and those who vanished was often no wider than a breath. In some areas, caves and rock shelters became precious anchors. Sites like Pinnacle Point in South Africa or the Grotte Mandrin in southern France hint at periods of repeated, if minimal, occupation. Charcoal, bones, and carefully chipped tools suggest that even as the world collapsed around them, some people found ways to return to these places, again and again, as if to remind themselves that stability, however fleeting, was still possible. These were not golden ages. Life expectancy may have been lower, infant mortality higher. Knowledge may have had to be relearned in each generation, as elders died before they could fully pass it on. But even then, something persisted, a way of reading the landscape, a sense of timing in migration, a memory of what plants could be eaten when. These weren't luxuries, they were the scaffolding of continuity. And continuity, it turns out, was the most vital resource of all. Genetic studies show something else remarkable. The people who passed through this bottleneck did not simply drift into survival. Their DNA shows signs of selection. Certain genes related to metabolism, immune response, and even brain function became more common. This suggests that the challenges weren't just culling the weak, they were refining the species, not through competition, but through constraint. What emerges from this crucible is not just a smaller humanity. It is a humanity that has been pressed into a new form, one more attuned to volatility, one more socially interdependent, one more flexible in thought and strategy. But this razor's edge came at a price. Every generation lived knowing that failure might mean erasure not just for the self, but for the line. The loss of a child, a flood, a failed hunt, any one of these could sever the thread entirely. And yet they walked forward. How do you keep walking when you carry not only your own life, but the burden of an entire species' future? To walk that narrow path required more than muscle or cleverness, it required trust. At such low population densities, no one could afford to live in isolation for long. A lone individual, or even a small family group, would quickly succumb to hunger, injury, or the silence of disconnection. Community was not optional. It was the structure in which survival became possible. And that meant something deeper than proximity. It meant cooperation. This is likely the period when bonds between unrelated individuals took on new importance. Kinship was no longer just biological, it was chosen, enacted, reinforced daily. Shared labor, shared food, shared watch through the night. And with that came the emergence of new kinds of memory, collective memory. Who knew how to track in snow? Who remembered where the last river still ran? Who could read the clouds for hints of coming frost? Knowledge, when carried alone, could be lost in a heartbeat. But when spread across a group, it endured. Archaeological hints support this. In sites associated with this period, we find more evidence of repeated tool types, not just individual improvisations, but traditions. This suggests people were teaching one another, even across generations. The tools become standardized, refined, carried from site to site. This may seem minor, but it speaks to the re-emergence of culture, not just survival techniques, but shared survival techniques, ideas becoming portable, teachable, repeatable, and in this repetition, something profound was preserved. These weren't just ways to hunt or cook. They were ways of being human-specific expressions of how to live in a collapsing world. This might be when storytelling began to emerge not just as entertainment, but as survival. Stories could encode danger, roots, the cycles of herds, the signs of illness. They carried the lessons of loss without requiring every group to live through it themselves. And within that network of stories and skills, something else endured. Hope. Even if the glaciers advanced, even if the sky darkened, even if the firewood was wet and the animals scarce, the act of remembering, of sharing memory, was a resistance against oblivion. Some researchers speculate that language itself may have consolidated and grown more complex during this time. The pressures of uncertainty would have made clarity and coordination essential. Misunderstandings could be fatal, but the ability to explain, to warn, to plan this was a lifeline. If true, then our very capacity for deep, abstract communication may have been sharpened in the teeth of extinction. And so the question lingers. When our ancestors stood on that knife's edge, too few to guarantee anything, was it language, story, or love that held them together? As ice clawed south and landscapes shifted beneath tired feet, the survivors clung to something even more fragile than fire: the ability to adapt without losing themselves. Adaptation didn't mean forgetting the past. It meant reshaping it to fit the present. A flint knapper who once worked stone near flowing rivers might now do so in wind-swept basins. A forager might relearn seasonal patterns, not because the plants changed, but because the rains no longer came when expected. Knowledge had to bend or break. That bending, slow, almost invisible, was happening at the biological level too. The tiny surviving population meant that genetic drift took stronger effect. Mutations that might have been diluted in larger groups now had a chance to persist. Some were lucky, improving resistance to disease or fine-tuning metabolism to cope with nutritional scarcity. Others may have introduced vulnerabilities. We carry both in our blood, and yet, this bottleneck, severe as it was, did not erase cultural diversity. What little evidence we have suggests that even scattered groups developed distinct practices. Some buried their dead with red ochre, others left behind strange engraved stones, a few carved lines into bone or ivory, perhaps tracking time or telling stories. These were not the marks of a species in decline. They were signs of life insisting on meaning. Even so, the knife edge remained. For thousands of years, it would have taken very little to end it all. One eruption, one extended drought, one failed generation. Extinction was not just a shadow behind them, it walked beside them. Every day was a negotiation with uncertainty. In this era, there were no empires, no monuments, no cities to crumble. If a lineage vanished, there was often no one to notice. No written lament, no ruined temple, just a silence where voices once rose. And yet we are here. Each of us carries the outcome of that tension. The resilience that held us together, the losses we no longer remember, the near misses that shaped us in ways we cannot measure. We are the descendants of people who saw everything taken from them and still passed something forward. Perhaps this is why, even now, we fear the empty wilderness, why we light candles in memory, why stories of the last of their kind echo so deeply. They are not distant fantasies, they are cellular memories, inherited echoes from when we really might have been the last. What does it mean that everything we are, every language, every love, every song, hangs from a thread that once frayed so close to breaking? Somewhere in that long night of prehistory, a quiet turning occurred. Not a triumph, not a moment of victory, but a shift, almost imperceptible at first. The extinction that had walked beside us began to fall behind. What had been a fight for every meal, every step, every breath, began to stabilize. The glacial rhythms still pulsed across the earth, and the cold still came, but the humans who remained had begun to build something deeper than mere survival. The signs of this are subtle. Hearths that were rebuilt in the same spot year after year, tools that show signs of refinement, not just function, traces of pigments used for no obvious reason, perhaps ritual, perhaps beauty, and bones laid carefully in the ground rather than discarded. In these small acts, we glimpse the return of intention, not just reacting to the world, but shaping it, even if just a little. We also begin to see signs of long-distance movement, not just wandering, but migration. Perhaps groups began to reconnect, forming webs of communication and exchange that spanned vast, icy landscapes. This might have been the beginning of networks fragile, yes, but vital. Information could now move faster than individuals. A discovery made in one place, a new trap, a better flint core, a way to preserve meat could be passed along through kin and strangers alike. This is when endurance became something more, resilience. The capacity not just to outlast disaster, but to learn from it, to become wiser, more cooperative, more prepared, to build a culture that could flex without shattering. It was not a golden age, but it was a foundation, and on that foundation, the story of humanity could begin again. What makes this so remarkable is that it was not guaranteed. There was no divine rescue, no sudden evolutionary leap. It was simply the outcome of countless decisions made by countless individuals to share food, to comfort a child, to try again after a loss. No single act saved humanity. It was the pattern, repeated millions of times, that kept the flame alive. And perhaps that's what defines us most. Not domination, not invention, but this. The ability to remain. To survive not as conquerors, but as caretakers of possibility. As stewards of a future that, for a very long time, was never promised. From that fragile thread, stretched across ice, hunger, and silence, every voice alive today has descended. So, we must ask, if we emerged from such closeness to nothingness, how shall we live now not just as survivors, but as inheritors of all that nearly vanished? This meant learning to endure in subtler ways, not by outlasting disaster through sheer toughness, but by growing more precise in how we lived. In a world that could turn barren in a single season, adaptation wasn't loud or dramatic. It whispered through habits, through gestures, through the way food was passed from hand to hand without a word. The humans who remained after the great bottleneck didn't dominate their surroundings, they negotiated with them. Each day was a quiet calculus. How far to travel, how much to gather, when to wait, when to risk. And behind those decisions was always a web of relationships, stretched across families and groups like invisible threads, delicate but essential. Anthropologists now understand cooperation not just as a cultural feature, but as a biological survival strategy. In the face of extreme scarcity, reciprocity became a lifeline. When one forager returned with roots or shellfish, they didn't hoard it for themselves. When a trapline yielded meat, it wasn't eaten in secrecy. Even with almost nothing, food was shared, knowledge was passed down, burdens were carried together. This wasn't altruism as we define it today, it was interdependence in its rawest form, and this pattern wasn't isolated. Across distant regions, small bands of humans began forming loose networks, alliances that transcended bloodlines. These were not permanent settlements or nations, but social webs that could stretch across valleys and time. When two groups met, they exchanged more than goods. They exchanged stories, gestures, tools, and sometimes people. Intermarriage between groups forged kinship where once there was only distance. Trust, once earned, could ripple outward. Such connections became crucial when the land failed. If herds migrated differently one year, or drought strangled a valley, a group with ties elsewhere had options. Mobility wasn't just about following game, it was about knowing where you could go and be received, not rejected. The rhythm of life itself adjusted to this interwoven survival. Campsites became more flexible. Group sizes expanded and contracted depending on need. Seasonal rounds grew more complex, weaving together ecological timing, social obligations, and personal memory. Within this growing mesh of adaptation, we begin to see the early stirrings of symbolic behavior not as decoration, but as a way to bind the invisible. Pieces of ochre marked with lines, beads carved from bone or shell, arrangements of stones that seemed to serve no practical purpose. These weren't frivolous acts, they were anchors for shared identity. They said, "We were here, we belong to one another, we remember." And so, these people survived not by building walls but by weaving bonds, not through conquest but through cooperation. What's striking isn't just that they chose this path, but that it worked. So we must ask, in a world that offered every reason to turn inward, why did our ancestors turn toward each other instead? When the land grew unreliable, so too did the old patterns of subsistence. Some landscapes no longer yielded what they once had. Familiar game animals grew scarce or migrated in unpredictable ways. Plants flowered too early or not at all. For the human bands who remained, survival would require more than just memory, it would require flexibility. And this flexibility, over time, became a kind of genius. Rather than depending on a single food source or hunting strategy, early humans began to diversify. This wasn't specialization, it was resilience through breadth. One group might trap birds and gather nuts in the autumn, then shift to fishing when the waters swelled in spring. Another might follow migrating herds, but supplement their diet with roots and insects when the hunt failed. These were not fallback strategies, they were integrated, deliberate choices. The diet of our ancestors widened, not narrowed, even in times of stress. Mobility became an art in itself. People moved not only with the seasons but with precision. Camps were temporary but carefully chosen, near fresh water, along migration corridors, shielded from wind. Knowledge of the land, what to expect, when to leave, was now a core skill. And since climate instability made conditions more variable, the ability to make decisions in motion became a trait as valuable as strength or speed. Within these movements, alliances mattered even more. A wandering group with no social ties was vulnerable, but a group that could travel known routes, stopping at familiar places with known allies, had options. A shared signal, a carved mark, a pattern of stones could mean the difference between welcome and suspicion. Over time, these signals likely became early markers of cultural identity, precursors to language, ritual, and belonging. And so, across hundreds of miles and generations of adaptation, survival began to look less like persistence and more like orchestration. Every decision to stay, to move, to share, to wait, played a part in the long composition of human continuity. Somewhere in this quiet recalibration, we also see an important shift, away from short-term survival toward long-term patterning. What worked once was not enough. What worked often became the gold standard. These were the seeds of planning, of memory systems, of inherited wisdom, because it wasn't enough to simply live. The goal had changed. Now, it was to live in a way that allowed others to live after you. Is this the moment where our species stopped being a reaction to its environment and began shaping its future with intention? What emerges from this time is not a triumphant civilization, but a humble mastery, the kind built slowly, under pressure, without ceremony. These weren't architects or kings. They were trackers, gatherers, tool makers, and teachers. And yet, in their quiet decisions, they laid the groundwork for everything that would come later. Evidence from this period suggests that symbolic behaviors once rare and isolated began to spread. At sites like Blombo's cave, we find pieces of ochre etched with deliberate patterns, beads made from shells, and stones seemingly arranged with care. None of these things were necessary for survival in the strictest sense, and that is what makes them so powerful. They point to a deeper layer of life, one concerned not just with enduring, but with meaning. To mark a pattern into a piece of ochre is to reach beyond the present moment. To make a bead is to carry beauty with you, to bury the dead with care, or to return to a place where ancestors once lived. These are signs of reflection. They suggest that even in the most precarious times, our ancestors were making space for memory, identity, and connection. What made this possible wasn't abundance, but cooperation. A group struggling just to eat has little room for art, unless its members are sharing the load. Only when labor is distributed and trust is strong can symbolic thought find room to breathe. In this sense, art may be the byproduct of collective success, not individual leisure. But symbols also serve another role. They bind. A shared motif, a carved design, a repeated gesture. These are ways of saying we are one people. When language was still fragile and inconsistent, these physical echoes gave shape to belonging. They turned memory into form, and form into resilience. It's possible that this period, with its mix of hardship and subtle creativity, represents the true birth of culture. Not the grand monuments we often imagine, but the woven practices of daily life. How food is shared, how stories are told, how children are comforted. These are the quiet architectures that hold a people together, and they would prove far more durable than any wall or spear. In the end, it may be that our survival had less to do with adaptation to the physical environment, and more to do with the environment we created among ourselves. So we must wonder, when did survival stop being about the strongest and begin depending on the most connected? From these small beginnings, shared food, shared symbols, shared stories, a new kind of survival took hold. One that didn't just adapt to the world, but began to remake it in quiet ways. Human beings were no longer simply shaped by the ice and wind. They were shaping themselves, their relationships, and even their memory of time. This shift is clearest not in monuments or inventions, but in patterns. Across distant regions, groups that had never met began expressing similar solutions. Tools grew more refined, more standardized. Ornaments appeared in places thousands of kilometers apart, beads made from shells that had to be carried inland, ochre used in ways that had nothing to do with utility. Even the use of pigments to decorate bodies or objects suggests a growing awareness of identity, of distinguishing not just the human from the non-human, but one group from another. This is how resilience becomes culture, and with culture came a soft but profound kind of power, memory held in form, in practice, in gesture. These weren't just clever tricks or adaptations to local conditions. They were expressions of long-term survival strategies. If a group passed down the right knowledge, how to find food in the dry season, how to interpret animal tracks, how to avoid dangerous terrain, they could outlast those who did not. The strength wasn't in physical force, it was in continuity. That continuity was tested again and again by the volatile Ice Age world. Droughts, freezes, sudden shifts in animal migration, all could erase a fragile group in a single generation. But the ones who wove their memory tightly into everything, into rituals, symbols, social expectations, had a better chance. They weren't just surviving events, they were learning from them. Mobility, too, became more than movement. It became a strategy of connection. Bands didn't wander randomly. They followed remembered trails, visited known sites, and reconnected with familiar allies. Certain caves or outcrops became meeting points, places to gather, to exchange goods, to retell old stories and form new plans. These gatherings were not only practical, they were affirmations that their way of life still endured, that they were not alone. In this way, survival became less about immediate reaction and more about pattern recognition, long memory, and coordination. If you could predict the path of a herd, or remember where water had pooled in a drought 3 years ago, you had an edge. If your group could organize itself to support the weak, teach the young, and resolve conflict without violence, you could stay intact. And so, slowly, the human world grew denser with meaning. Every gesture held weight. Every return to a sacred place reaffirmed connection. And every decision, however small, was no longer just about the present, it was about preserving a future others might yet inherit. What kind of strength does it take to build a future not for yourself, but for someone you will never meet? That quiet strength, the kind that builds futures unseen, may be the most overlooked force in our evolutionary story. It doesn't leave behind monuments or bones or broken weapons, but its traces linger in every symbol etched into ochre, in every worn path revisited year after year, in every tool shaped just so by hands who never met. This was not strength measured in dominance, but in duration, in the ability to continue, generation after generation, despite the chaos of the world. In the deep cold of the Ice Age, this kind of continuity was rare. Many species rose and vanished within the span of a few glacial pulses. Even among other human relatives, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, the mysterious populations whose traces flicker briefly in our genomes, the thread eventually broke, but for one lineage, it held. Why? The answer is not simple. It lies somewhere in the fabric of small things: a meal shared without debt, a path taught to a child, a story told one more time around the fire. These gestures are soft, almost invisible in the archaeological record, but they create bonds that can survive when everything else fails. The fragile fabric of human culture, woven with memory, reinforced by trust, outlasted catastrophe, not by resisting it, but by bending with it. In these subtle patterns, we see the seeds of everything to come. Not just the survival of Homo sapiens, but the emergence of a species capable of carrying ideas, emotions, and hopes across time. The fire wasn't just for warmth anymore. The gathering wasn't only for safety. Every interaction carried with it a chance to teach, to reflect, to pass along something deeper than instinct. And in those long winters when food was scarce, when death was near, what may have mattered most wasn't the hunt or the tool, but the story. The story kept the past alive. It gave shape to the unknown. It reminded the listeners, even the youngest ones, that they came from somewhere and that they still belonged. By the time conditions began to shift once more, when climates warmed and the ice retreated, the humans who emerged were not just survivors. They were the heirs of an entire strategy: cooperation over conflict, memory over might, belonging over isolation. These were not traits chosen in peace, but forged in hardship. And they would become the scaffolding for all future human complexity. The roots of ritual, of storytelling, of shared belief systems, they all grow from this soil. Even today, in the rhythms of our daily lives, the echoes of those strategies remain. In how we gather, in how we care, in how we seek meaning. Even when survival is no longer in doubt, what persisted through the Ice Age was not just a species, it was a way of being. And so the chapter of brute survival closed. Not with conquest, but with connection. Not with triumph, but with trust. The world was still dangerous. The path ahead still uncertain. But the foundation was there, not carved in stone, but inscribed in memory, behavior, and quiet alliance. So the question is no longer how we endured. It is, what will we do with the strategies that allowed us to endure? The skills that once kept early humans alive through the bitterest ice, their cooperation, their mobility, their memory, had become instinctual. These strategies, refined over generations of uncertainty, didn't vanish when the world began to soften. They remained embedded in the way people moved, gathered, and trusted one another. But now, something profound was beginning to change. The cold was easing, the land was shifting, and with that shift came the quiet arrival of abundance. It began gradually, too slowly for any one person to notice, but visible across the span of centuries. Ice sheets that had once dominated continents began to retreat. As they receded, they left behind rich soils, braided rivers, and strange new ecosystems. What had been frozen for lifetimes now awakened. Forests crept northward. Grasslands stretched farther across the steppe. The wind grew softer. The air less dry. Animals followed this change, carving new migration paths into landscapes long thought barren. Reindeer, aurochs, and wild horses returned. Birds nested where only frost had clung to stone. And behind them, scattered human groups still few in number, but growing followed in cautious waves. We see the signs in sediment and ash, in layers of pollen and bones. But we also see it in tools, in campsites, in the return to familiar valleys. People were no longer clinging to hidden refuges. They were venturing outward, not in desperation, but with intent. And as the land opened, so did the future. The humans who stepped into this new world were not the same as those who had entered the bottleneck tens of thousands of years before. They were fewer, but more unified. Their survival had been forged not by dominance, but by connection bonds that were flexible, intelligent, and deeply social. Now, they carried that quiet wisdom into a world with more to offer, and they did not forget how quickly it could all vanish. Abundance did not erase their caution. It shaped their curiosity. People returned to old places, but saw them differently. They settled near rivers, yet remained ready to move. They marked the land, but they listened to it too. The scars of scarcity had not made them fearful, they had made them alert. This was not a triumphant return. It was something quieter, a reawakening of possibility. So the question becomes, if survival no longer demanded all our attention, what else might we begin to build? The numbers began to rise, not quickly, not evenly, but undeniably. Human groups that had once hovered on the edge of disappearance started expanding, slowly reclaiming space across the continents. From a population that may have numbered only in the low thousands at its narrowest point, the human story began to widen again. How fragile is rebirth when the memory of collapse is still close behind? The warming world offered more than just comfort. It offered room for movement, for experimentation, for life to unfurl beyond necessity. Valleys that had once been locked in permafrost now opened into fertile plains. Lakes reappeared in old basins. Forests returned where tundra had held sway. And in these returning zones, early humans did not simply pass through, they began to stay. Archaeological evidence suggests that the people of this period returned again and again to certain places, river mouths, upland clearings, sheltered ridges. These were not permanent settlements, but seasonal reoccupations, familiar waypoints that became embedded in collective memory. And at each return, something changed. Tools were refined. Campsites became more organized. The pace of life shifted not into stillness, but into rhythm. The adaptive strategies honed during scarcity did not vanish with the cold. They evolved. Mobility remained essential, but it became more strategic, tied to seasons, to animal migrations, to trade with other bands. Diets stayed broad and flexible. If one food source failed, there were others to fall back on. And with environmental diversity came cultural diversity. New tools, new methods of processing food, new symbolic expressions. We see the traces of this growth in the archaeological record, not in monuments or mass graves, but in subtle, consistent change. Microlithic tools appear in some regions, small, precise, efficient. In others, we see the rise of composite implements tools made of multiple parts, reflecting forethought and coordination. Bone needles suggest sewn clothing. Fishhooks indicate knowledge of local waters, And ornaments, beads, ochre, carved tokens hint at growing social complexity. But perhaps most telling is the growing spread of people themselves. Genetic data shows lineages branching out, recombining, diverging, not in isolation, but through contact. This was not a single group slowly growing larger. It was many small groups, adapting in parallel and occasionally reconnecting. And so, the world was no longer defined by bottlenecks, but by webs. Thin at first, fragile, but they held. And through them, ideas could move faster than people, knowledge of plants, animals, weather patterns, tool-making. The land was no longer just a backdrop for survival. It had become a medium for exchange. Even as human numbers rose, the lesson of scarcity lingered. These were still people who remembered hunger, who remembered the cold, and that memory, rather than fading, may have made the new world feel all the more precious. So what do you carry forward when you've survived the impossible and suddenly find yourself surrounded by life again? In a world where the land was becoming generous again, it would have been easy to forget the lessons of hardship. But our ancestors did not forget. Their survival had depended not just on finding food or escaping cold, but on building social structures strong enough to carry memory itself. Now, those same structures would help them navigate a different kind of challenge. How to thrive without unraveling. Abundance brings choices, and choices require judgment. What we see in the archaeological record from this period is not a simple explosion of progress, but a careful layering of wisdom over opportunity. Communities didn't immediately settle down into villages. They didn't rush into agriculture. What they did was more subtle. They expanded their networks, refined their technologies, and deepened their symbolic worlds. Social cohesion remained the backbone. We find signs that long-distance exchange became more common: obsidian from distant mountains, shells from far-off coasts, pigments sourced from specific deposits. These objects didn't move on their own. They moved through people, through handshakes, agreements, seasonal meetings. This wasn't trade as conquest, it was trade as connection. To maintain such wide ties, trust had to be stronger than ever. And trust requires continuity of behavior, of expectation, of shared meaning. That's where symbols became essential. A carved pendant, a painted design, a patterned bead. These weren't decorations, they were signals. They said, I come from somewhere, I carry something you recognize. It's here that the quiet strategies of earlier chapters begin to mature. The sharing of food, the care for the sick, the burial of the dead all continue. But now they're joined by something more. Story. Not just in the sense of memory, but in myth, in origin tales, animal spirits, ancestral echoes. These narratives were not mere entertainment. They were how a people explained their place in a world that no longer tried to kill them at every turn. Because abundance can be confusing. It can create new inequalities, new temptations, new rivalries. But stories shared. Stories provide orientation. They remind the group of its values, its ancestors, its obligations. In this way, meaning became its own form of survival. Mobility remained, but it began to shift shape. Groups now followed not just animals and seasons, but traditions. They revisited old campgrounds not because they were the only option, but because they had become sacred, part of the group's identity. Movement, once a necessity, was becoming a rhythm, and with that rhythm came something revolutionary. Planning. We find evidence of caches, buried stores of food, prepared for future use. We find signs of resource management, such as selective hunting or controlled burning. These were people thinking not just about the present, but about their children's world. So perhaps the question is no longer how we survived. Perhaps the deeper mystery is how, after all that, we remembered how to live. To live, truly live, is not merely to breathe. It is to shape the hours between waking and sleep with meaning. And in the warmer world that followed the Ice Age, that meaning began to take root in quiet but enduring forms. Our ancestors, once scattered bands on the edge of extinction, began to craft lives that reached beyond survival. Across different regions, we begin to see echoes of shared intention. It was no longer just about food or fire. It was about belonging. And belonging needs more than shelter. It needs identity, ritual, and memory that extends beyond a single generation. This is where symbolic culture deepens. Carved objects, abstract patterns, ochre lines on cave walls, all of them whisper the same thing. We are here, and we were here before. A dot becomes a map. A line becomes a journey. A handprint becomes a declaration of presence in time. In places like Blombo's cave, painted stones and engraved tools suggest long chains of teaching and imitation. These were not isolated acts of creativity. They were inherited, passed down, and repeated, likely with stories attached. And in this transmission, the most powerful tool of all emerges: continuity. We begin to see burials that reflect care bodies laid with intention, accompanied by ochre, antler tools, or ornaments. In some cases, individuals appear to have been placed in familiar positions, as if mimicking the posture of sleep. Death, once something to endure or fear, was now framed, prepared for. That preparation suggests belief. And belief suggests a world larger than the present moment. This expansion of mental space beyond now, beyond self, is perhaps the clearest marker of the transformation happening in this age. A species that once clung to riverbanks for safety was now contemplating what comes after death, or what holds a group together across generations. No longer merely reacting to the world, they were reflecting upon it. And still, the adaptive core remained. These changes did not mean the end of mobility or flexibility. Groups still moved with the seasons, still adjusted their diets to fit changing climates. But now those changes were interpreted through shared meaning. A bad harvest might be seen as misalignment with ancestral rules. A bountiful season might become the subject of a ritual. In this way, interpretation became as important as observation. Here lies one of the quiet revolutions of this period: that humans were beginning not just to inhabit the landscape, but to narrate it, to walk through a valley and know its story, to climb a ridge and remember who came before. This wasn't just memory. It was geography, woven with experience. So we arrive at a pivotal turn, no longer shaped entirely by nature, but shaping it in return, using not only tools and fire, but imagination. If the Ice Age gave us resilience, perhaps this new age gave us the capacity to remember what it meant. The world had changed not just in temperature, but in tone. Where once the land demanded silence and caution, now it invited voice. The species that had barely held on during the coldest millennia was no longer simply enduring. It was listening, remembering, shaping, and responding. And through that, something new began to stir. What does it mean to become custodians of a world that once threatened to erase us? In this closing phase of the Ice Age, we begin to see traces of conscious adaptation, not merely to survive, but to shape futures. The humans emerging into these warmer epochs were more than descendants of survivors. They were stewards of memory, cooperation, and possibility. And the landscapes they returned to were not just resources, but relationships, places with stories, rhythms, responsibilities. As populations expanded, so too did the need for coordination. Seasonal gathering sites, once transient, began to develop layers of reuse. Paths between sites became habitual. Language, surely long present, likely evolved in complexity, reflecting the richness of shared experience. A tool was no longer just a tool, it had a name, a lineage, a place in the fabric of living. The importance of social bonds deepened. Those who remembered how to give, how to share, how to teach these became the leaders. Authority did not grow from domination, but from wisdom and cohesion. The ones who knew the old ways and could navigate the new ones held the trust of the group. And so the core lesson of the bottleneck, that life continues only through each other, was not lost. It was scaled. The networks grew. The symbols multiplied. The cultural scaffolding became denser, more flexible, more resilient. Yet even in growth, the memory of scarcity remained close. You can hear it in the careful balance of use and restraint. In some areas, humans began to gently alter their environments, clearing brush, timing their hunts, managing fire, not through brute force, but through attunement. This wasn't domination. It was dialogue. That restraint was likely not accidental. It was born from an intimate awareness of how little stood between life and loss. The world had opened again, yes, but it was still capable of closing. What emerged at the end of this long return was a species not defined by the catastrophe it survived, but by the behaviors it chose to preserve in spite of it. Empathy, memory, adaptability, culture. These were the quiet strategies that had once allowed us to endure the unimaginable. Now, they became the architecture of something even rarer in the natural world. Continuity. With the ice in retreat and the land unfolding in green, humanity stood not as conqueror, but as witness to a second beginning. And in that moment of peace, so hard-won and so tentative, a deeper challenge emerged. If we were no longer defined by scarcity, then what kind of world would we create in its absence? If we were no longer defined by scarcity, then what kind of world would we create in its absence? This is not just a poetic question. It is a mirror. Because the world you and I inhabit today, paved, wired, restless, is not disconnected from that long-forgotten age. It is shaped by it. And not just physically, in the tools we use or the migrations our ancestors made, but internally in how we think, how we bond, how we fear and hope. Beneath our technologies, our ideologies, our cities, something far older still breathes. So what happens to a species that has passed through fire? The answer may lie not in the great monuments of history, but in the quieter inheritances that ripple beneath every human life. When we look at the archaeological record, we see a population reduced to a sliver, perhaps just over 1,000 individuals. But when we look inward, we see what that crucible left behind. A psychology moulded by scarcity, a nervous system attuned to risk, a need for belonging that once meant life or death. We carry, in our very chemistry, the legacy of survivors. Biologists call this a bottleneck. Not just a moment of loss, but of compression of everything narrowing to a thread and then continuing. And from that thread, every human being alive today descends. Not just genetically, but behaviorally. The stress responses that flood your body during fear, the need to be accepted by others, the vigilance you feel when the world grows uncertain. These are not flaws, they are adaptations. The evidence is subtle but persistent. Anthropologists have noted how deeply we favor group identity, how our brains are wired to read faces, how storytelling itself may have evolved as a way to bind communities together. These are not cultural quirks. They are remnants of a time when knowing who could be trusted and who might leave you behind meant the difference between being fed or forgotten. And yet, there is more to this inheritance than caution. Within the fossil record, the genetic studies, and the campfires of the past, there is also proof of something else. Generosity. Those who shared food, those who nursed the wounded, those who taught the young, even when there was no time to spare. These behaviors, too, survived. And in some ways, they survived even more powerfully. Because they did not just protect the body, they shaped the future. So we are the product not just of endurance, but of care, not just of desperation, but of grace. And when we look at our own lives, our conflicts, our longings, our anxieties and hopes, we can begin to see the map beneath the surface. How much of what we feel and fear and strive for is ancient? To understand ourselves truly, calmly, without illusion, we must return to the landscapes that made us, not as tourists of prehistory, but as inheritors of its lessons. Because what we carry is not just DNA, it's expectation, it's instinct, it's the framework through which we interpret the world around us. Why do we feel uneasy in silence? Why do we scan for threat, even in safety? These patterns are not accidents, they are echoes. In the long winters of the Ice Age, silence meant absence of animals, of warmth, of others. To feel alone was not symbolic. It was dangerous. The mind adapted. Those who were quick to notice change, to feel discomfort before certainty, to imagine what could go wrong, they were more likely to survive. Today, that same vigilance lives on in our anxious thoughts, our racing minds, our need to be near others, even when we don't understand why. And yet, this inheritance is not a prison. Within the quiet paranoia of survival lives another trait: adaptability. The human mind is perhaps the most flexible tool evolution has ever produced. Our ancestors adjusted not just to new climates, but to new ideas. They adopted tools from other groups. They learned to track animals they'd never seen before. They remembered landscapes passed down only in stories. This mental plasticity, the ability to update, to imagine, to plan, is part of what pulled us through the bottleneck, and it's what allows us now, millennia later, to reflect on it at all. Some researchers suggest that the intensity of that ancient trial shaped not only our behaviors, but the architecture of consciousness itself. That the awareness of others, the ability to imagine their needs, their pain, their intentions may have been selected for as strongly as any physical trait. Empathy, in this view, is not just moral, it is adaptive. It kept the fire tended when someone fell ill. It shared food when the hunt failed. It sang songs when the darkness pressed too close. We are not descended from the strongest, the fastest, or the fiercest. We are descended from those who stayed close, and from this nearness came something astonishing: the human sense of time. Once, the present was all that mattered. But when survival became a project of many of parents, children, elders, memory lengthened, anticipation grew. Life became not just a string of moments, but a shape, a story. So when we speak of inheritance, we must speak of this too: the narrative mind, the instinct to ask what happened and what might happen next. These are not luxuries, they are the structure of our survival. Could it be that we are storytellers, not in spite of our past suffering, but because of it? The stories we carry are not always told out loud. Some live in our gestures, our fears, our reflexes. Others are etched into our cultures in rituals we've long forgotten how to explain, in symbols that persist even when their original meanings have faded. These are the quiet residues of a long passage through darkness. How many of our modern behaviors are ancient solutions with new disguises? Take, for example, the modern fixation on belonging, the pain of rejection, the fear of exclusion. These emotions, overwhelming as they can be, are not signs of weakness. They are evolutionary memories. When small bands of humans were all that remained, exile meant death. Connection was not optional. It was oxygen. That truth still hums beneath the surface of every conversation, every dinner table, every outstretched hand. Or consider the drive for meaning, the yearning to feel that our lives matter, that we are part of something larger. This too may have roots in survival. In a world of scarcity, those who believed their actions rippled outward, who saw their choices as part of a longer thread, may have been more likely to invest in cooperation. Meaning became a glue. It held groups together. And eventually, it gave rise to myth, morality, and memory. Even our sense of fairness, so intense in children, so universal across cultures, may be an inheritance. Small groups cannot survive if some members consistently take more than they give. Reciprocity isn't just a social ideal. It's an ancient survival strategy, now woven into our sense of justice. So we walk today in a modern world, shaped by ancient contours. We build cities, write laws, fly to other planets, and still, we argue over belonging. We fear abandonment. We hunger for stories. We seek patterns. None of these impulses are flaws. They are echoes. And they are not static. Because the Ice Age did not end human evolution, it refined it. The people who passed through that crucible didn't just adapt to a single environment. They learned to adapt to adaptation itself. Their flexibility in behavior, in emotion, in culture became the real inheritance. And it is this same flexibility that allows us now, in an age of abundance and confusion, to reflect on who we are and where we come from. What we carry forward is not a single answer. It is a question, renewed with each generation. How shall we live now, knowing what came before? The 1% who survived did not leave behind a manual. They left behind possibilities, ways of thinking, bonding, sensing, imagining, and whether we honor that inheritance or ignore it, we are shaped by it. Either way, in their footsteps, we continue not just as descendants, but as participants in the same fragile continuity. To participate in continuity is to live with a certain humility. We are not the beginning of anything, nor its end. We are a brief, burning moment in a lineage nearly lost, a thread stretched across 1,000,000 winters held together by hands we will never know. And yet, somehow, it held. What does it mean to be shaped by people we can never remember? Even now, in your body, traces of them remain. The way your nervous system responds to threat, the way your emotions tighten when trust is broken, the comfort you feel near fire, or in groups, or in rhythm. These are not coincidences. They are fossils of experience, carved into the architecture of your being. And then there's the inheritance you cannot touch, the invisible toolkit. Flexibility, curiosity, ritual, language, empathy. None of these emerged suddenly. They accumulated across lifetimes, passed not through blood alone, but through shared space, shared songs, shared stories. You may not remember them, but they remembered you. That is the astonishing truth of deep ancestry. Those who endured, who shared food and warmth, who held on even when the world grew mute and empty, they imagined you. Maybe not you specifically, but something like you. They planned for a future they would never see. They raised children who raised children who raised children until someone taught you your name. Their gift is not finished. Because inheritance is not just what is given, it's what is done with it. The legacy of survival can harden into fear, or it can soften into compassion. It can echo as mistrust or become the root of wisdom. What matters is how the next link in the chain is forged. And that link, now, is you. In a world so different from theirs, and yet shaped by their shadow, you are not cut off. You are continuation. So when you share a meal with others, when you sing, when you care for someone sick, when you tell a story, when you watch the stars, know that these moments are not new, they are old. Older than writing, older than cities, older than memory, and yet, through you, they are alive again. Perhaps this is what it truly means to survive. Not just to endure the storm, but to carry forward the soul of what made us human in the first place. And so we ask not in despair, but in reverence, if we are no longer fighting simply to live, then what kind of beings are we now becoming? So, what kind of beings are we now becoming? If we still carry the shape of ancient struggle, we also carry the grace of ancient repair. We are not just survivors of catastrophe. We are descendants of those who chose kindness, memory, and imagination over silence. And in the calm that follows the storm, what we do with that legacy becomes the next story. All across the modern world, in cities and forests, in solitude and community, we still enact fragments of the past. We gather around fires or their electric descendants. We listen for stories that explain the mystery of being alive. We care for our young, for our elders, for the ones who wander. We seek rhythm, pattern, belief. And when crisis strikes, whether personal or global, we reach back through instinct to those old behaviors, sharing, protecting, adapting, telling each other, we'll find a way. The way is rarely easy. In fact, the ease of modern life often disguises just how vulnerable we still are, not to mammoths or glaciers, but to forgetting. Forgetting how much was sacrificed to arrive here. Forgetting how fragile continuity really island, and forgetting that everything we build, from skyscrapers to moral codes, is built on top of a silence filled with memory. Because the truth is, only 1% made it through, and we are all of them now. That number isn't a statistic, it's a warning, it's a whisper, it's a miracle. To survive a bottleneck so narrow, to expand again into so many forms, so many languages, so many dreams, this is not something to take for granted. It is a testament not to conquest, but to cooperation, not to dominance, but to endurance. The quiet inheritance we carry is not written in heroic tales of warriors or kings. It's in the softness of how we hold each other when we grieve. It's in the way we wait for someone to catch up. It's in the instinct to include a stranger at the edge of the circle. These small gestures, ancient, universal, may be the oldest truths we have. So now, as you sit wherever you are, listening to the echoes of that deep time, take a moment to notice what you feel. That strange calm, that quiet awe, that sense of distance folding in. It's not accidental. It's not artificial. It's the part of you that remembers. Even if you've never walked across a frozen plain, even if you've never gone hungry under stars, something in you has, and something in you survived. The great trials of prehistory are gone, but new ones are always arriving. Climate shifts, technological upheavals, moments of isolation, disconnection, confusion. The landscape may look different, but the need is the same. Not to be the strongest, not to be the loudest, but to be the one who remembers how to stay human when it matters most. That is the thread we are still weaving. We don't inherit the earth from 1,000 ancestors because we deserve it. We inherit it because they did not give up, and in a quiet, continuous way, they are still here watching through our choices, speaking through our stories, living through our care. So as this story closes, listen to what remains. The voice of survival is not shouting. It is not fire and glory. It is breath, offered freely. It is the circle, held open. It is one hand reaching back and one hand reaching forward, and somewhere in between is you. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this long road through the ice, listening to the quiet echoes of survival that shaped us long before memory began. If this story helped you feel a little more grounded, a little more connected, or sparked a new kind of question inside you, then I'm deeply grateful for your presence here tonight. I wonder what part of this journey will stay with you, perhaps not in words, but in a quiet shift in how you see the world. Whether it was the silence of a child's grave beside a mammoth bone, the warmth of fire passed hand to hand in the dark, or the strange, fragile thread that bound 1% of us to tomorrow, these are the fragments that make us human and hold us together even now. If any of those moments lingered with you, I'd be honored if you shared them in the comments as a quiet offering to the others gathered here, puzzling through these stories together. Feel free to like, share, or subscribe if you'd like to follow the next trail with us. We'll soon step into another forgotten chapter, one that's waiting just beneath your feet. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,